Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. It is Sunday, April the 26th. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We are here along with Lisa Mateo, and we're coming to you live from Washington, D.C. in our studio here, where we're following breaking news this morning. A suspect is under arrest after shots were fired last night at the White House Correspondents' dinner.
The president and his cabinet are unhurt. We got an update from the president shortly after this. Christina, Lisa, we heard from him talking about his understanding of what had happened when the suspect has been arrested. But there was such a yawning period of confusion after this happened, both within the ballroom and afterwards.
It really was. So we were all at the dinner, and most of the Bloomberg correspondents you're going to hear from today were all at the dinner. The story is not about us, but it's relevant, so that's why we're bringing it up. But as you were just saying, David, we were in different places. And Lisa, you guys were evacuated, and I and Jeff Mason were stuck on the floor for quite a while with no information.
Yeah, and I think the amazing thing was just seeing the different responses from people, like whether it was fear, whether it was confusion, some people ducking under tables, people weren't sure. It was just a lot of confusion, a lot of chaos all at once.
And then after quite a prolonged period of time, I would say at least an hour, Zhang, who's the president of the Correspondents Association, said, stand by, we're going to resume. And we were at the table with White House personnel who were hearing on their phones that the president wanted to restart the event. They wanted to have the dinner. I think security and logistically, and it was an active crime scene that just wasn't possible. So the president went back to the White House and had a press conference, and we're going to play some of that for you here in a bit. But first, Lisa, you want to kick us off with the headlines? I apologize. Yeah. I apologize. We've got a... Okay, we're waiting for something to push. We've had some breaking news here this morning, so stand by just a bit. We're going to play some of those clips for you. We should have them shortly, but...
Let's talk a bit about just the scene itself. So this is a president who has in the past avoided going to this dinner. He has declined invitations to attend this dinner in the past. This is the first time that President Trump agreed to do so. The dinner took place at the Washington Hilton in Northwest Washington in a very large ballroom. Many hundreds of people.
It is the biggest ballroom in Washington, D.C. It has been for years. That's why the dinner is there, because it is such a popular ticket. The capacity is huge. I think it's just over 1,000 people. It is a coveted ticket. And over the years, I've been going to this dinner on and off for the last decade. They have added more and more tables. And I don't know if you noticed, when you sit down and the chairs are pulled out, you actually can't move between the tables. It's not safe passage, and that's something I've always noticed, and a lot of us have always noticed. If there were an emergency, how would you evacuate that room? Because you really can't. And we were on the floor. You could see the Secret Service trying to evacuate the cabinet members, and we're going to play that video here shortly. In order to get to them, they were literally tossing chairs. Oh, we've got it right now, so we're going to catch you up to date.
As the president was having his mind read by the evening's entertainment, several thuds could be heard in the ballroom. Initially, neither the president nor the guests took much notice. Then, a column of security, Secret Service, and tactical teams swarmed the ballroom. The vice president and president were quickly whisked off stage, followed by the president of the White House press corps, Lisa Mateo. Secret Service jumped tables and flipped chairs to rush cabinet members, including Stephen Miller and a pregnant Katie Miller, out a side door. The Speaker of the House was rushed through the lobby. Cabinet secretaries were extracted from their tables, while ambassadors, VIPs, and guests sheltered under them. Journalists ducked for cover while trying to record on their phones. Guests who weren't evacuated were asked to wait. But with an active crime scene just outside the ballroom door, the president instead called a press conference at the White House.
Can you describe what was going through your mind, how you were feeling in that moment?
That's a very good question, actually. It's always shocking when something like this happens. It's happened to me a little bit, and that never changes. The fact, we were sitting right next to each other, the First Lady on my right, and I heard a noise and sort of thought it was a tray. I thought it was a tray going down. I've heard that many times, and it was a pretty loud noise. And it was from quite far away. He hadn't breached the area at all. They really got him. But so it was quite far away, but it was a gun. And some people really understood that pretty quickly. Other people didn't. I was watching to see what was happening. Probably should have gone down even faster.
Back at the Hilton, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, Mayor of D.C., and Chief of Police held a press conference.
I'm not exactly 100% familiar with this building. I do know in this incident tonight, I know there was a security plan that was developed by the Secret Service that the Metropolitan Police Department assisted with, and I know that security plan did work this evening.
Leaving many unanswered questions, an empty ballroom, and visibly shaken staff left to clean up the mess.
Joining us now are Bloomberg's Eric Martin, who covers the State Department, and Jeff Mason, Bloomberg's White House correspondent. Jeff, you are also a former head of the White House Correspondents Association. You have planned this dinner, and when we were talking while the piece was rolling, you were very adeptly correcting me. I thought capacity was like 1,200 in the room, but you were telling me it's much more than that.
It's more than twice that. It's about 2,600, and as you said, it's a room full of journalists, of course, members of the White House Correspondents Association, their sources, government officials, and last night was especially newsy before all of this happened because President Trump was coming for the first time and hadn't come during any of the years that he was president during his first term, and this is the first time he's come during his second term. He's been, of course, before as a guest, I believe in 2011 when President Obama was in office.
Jeff, talk about the effort that goes into planning this event. You mentioned you were the president of that association. Yeah. My understanding is that's like a second full-time job to have to do all this. This is the marquee event that you have to be working toward. And I think a question that a lot of folks have is, what is it like to have this event at that hotel, to secure it? Was anything different about the way that the hotel was secured last night compared to what you've seen in years past, and certainly when you were running the association?
Well, I can tell you, number one, in terms of the planning, it takes months, and the ballroom itself, the space, is booked more than a year in advance. So it was interesting to me that the president said last night he wanted it to be rescheduled within 30 days. I mean, just from a purely logistical level, I don't know how easy that would be, given that that type of thing requires way advanced booking. And to your question about security, David, I didn't notice anything different last night, other than to get into the hotel, I had to show, and I bet you guys had to show, just a ticket outside on the street. Which was, that was a little bit... I've had that
happen in years past, though.
Okay.
It's like any security situation, it's only as strong as the person at the checkpoint, so it can vary depending on how strict they're being. But I have had in various years, sometimes they make you show a ticket on the street, and sometimes not so much.
That's right. But the key point in terms of security is there's not a magnetometer available or necessary until the ballroom floor. So the floors above that, not just including the guest room floors, but the couple floors below or right above that, where there are receptions that people can go to and do go to, are unsecure. And that, I think, is going to be a question for law enforcement authorities as to how secure this whole space was and is up till that point where you go through the magnetometers to go into the ballroom.
Eric, I want to ask you, because you were there with us all evening, we played that clip of the president, and Jeff and I were talking about this as well. It doesn't look like he either doesn't register the noise or just, it was a very, I mean, David, you were there, it was a very loud room. I don't know what you guys heard, but in hindsight, I figured out what it was, but in the moment, it wasn't clear what it was, and I'm wondering what the people around you thought it was, or if you, like most of my table, didn't know this was happening until we saw a phalanx of security streaming down that one open center aisle, and then the guns came out and everybody got down.
So our table was in the outer ring of the ballroom, closest to where these shots rang out.
Okay.
And so we were just sitting there, actually with my back to the stage. The way the seating arrangement was, a circular table, and pouring a glass of wine, having a salad, and then suddenly out of nowhere I heard this pop, 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 like 4 successive, very quick sounds, and there was kind of a...
Did you stop? Like, was it loud enough where you were that people, like, stopped?
Absolutely. Everyone was, I think everyone around me was wondering what that sound was, and then there was kind of a group reaction. I mean, it's almost like a wave at the baseball park when you see everybody else, in that case, rising. In this case, everybody else was diving. People were getting under tables. We heard someone shout, "Get down." And so everyone just threw themselves on the ground. And, of course, in this context and understanding, you have the president, the vice president, basically the entire cabinet at this event. In that context, certainly the first few seconds, it occurred to me, at least, that this could be a target for an attack. I was terrified. I thought about also when the Secret Service agents burst through the door, it wasn't apparent to me, at least, whether it was an outside security response to protect us or an attack happening. And so you wonder about with the strength of automatic weapons and things, you're wondering, is somebody straying the ballroom with bullets? What is going on? Absolutely terrifying. I had my heart in my throat for a few seconds until we heard that the sound went down, and then you heard the security personnel evacuating people.
I just want to echo what Eric's saying. I was seated near him, and there is this huge well where a lot of tables were, you both included, and we were on this kind of outer perimeter circumference of the room, closer to that noise. And I think, Jeff, what was striking to me was kind of the quiet that emerged after that happened. And there was a very long period where we were kind of all awaiting instruction on what we should do in the moments that followed. And there really wasn't an announcement for 10, 15 minutes till I think on that outer rim, were told that we had to leave the place entirely. And then there was this kind of strange dichotomy. You two both remained in the room.
We had no information, and the phones were not working. At one point, they were not working. And, protocol is to jam signals and stuff like this. I don't know if this happened or not. And then this always happens in any crush of people. There's just not enough bandwidth in people. But we were getting no information. I didn't know you guys had left. And we were all just kind of looking around. The other question, Jeff, is there were so many cabinet members there. Who was a designated survivor? Do we know?
I don't know the answer to that. But I do think, to your point, David, and to what both of you are saying, the information sort of depended a little bit based on where you were, or the signals and the instructions depended a little bit on where you were. Where I was, there were no instructions. I could also hear those popping sounds, and everyone at my table also went straight down underneath and stayed there for a while. But my own feeling was like, okay, so what are we supposed to do? Because when you started to hear any sounds or words from people, one of them I know that you had in your video, Christina, was of some people shouting USA, USA. My initial thought at that point was a negative one, that whoever was shouting that might be a gunman himself or herself coming through. So there just wasn't much that you could tell when you were underneath the table and listening for instructions as to whether to stay, whether to go, whether to evacuate, whether to wait. And that played out up on the stage as well. The president and the vice president were evacuated, but I know that some members of the board of the White House Correspondents Association who were seated on the dais were told not to move until the principals were secured.
With the USA, but Eric, to your point, I was next to someone who was shouting USA, USA, so I knew who it was, and I knew it was an administration official.
That's interesting. Of course, then you would have known that.
So I did turn to them and say, they need to clear the room, you need to be quiet, and they did. But I heard from you and from others, especially those who had been at January 6th, or those who had been at events like that was the scariest part, to your point, because it was very unclear if the threat was coming from outside or inside the ballroom, and because there was no instruction, and really never was security-wise for us, not a lot, that was one of the more terrifying moments, especially for people who've covered January 6th and other things like that, is where is this coming from, and are they already in the room?
And we heard the doors burst open, and when you take a moment to reflect, you realize that probably given how secure the ballroom itself was, that it would have been very hard for somebody to get through those doors. But in the moment, it was very unclear. It was just a lot of noise. Everyone was down. Yeah. I saw a few colleagues, particularly photographers, who have perhaps been in this kind of hostile environment before, standing up and taking photos to document what was going on. I think for many of us, it was just a survival and self-preservation instinct. I know it was not. I had someone ask me, were people screaming, were people shouting? I said, no, it was quite organized, actually. And people were being very, very cautious and trying not to spread panic, but I think just trying to get down and to listen for instructions. Obviously, the fact that the shooter was able to gain access to the hotel or to this space at all is concerning, and I'm sure is something that that security, Secret Service, police, FBI will be reviewing. In a certain way, as President Trump said, the Secret Service they performed valiantly. They kept everyone in the ballroom safe. No one in the ballroom was injured or killed. And so that part of the security plan to secure the ballroom worked, but obviously extremely concerning that someone could get as close as this individual apparently did to all of the activity, to the cabinet, to thousands of people. This could have turned out far worse than it did.
Jeff, pick up on something that Eric said. I was in the lobby waiting after we'd been taken out of the ballroom. I noticed there are just regular guests at the hotel there as well. Clarify that for us as well. It's not like the White House Correspondents Association buys out the hotel for the night. It is very much a hotel where other visitors to Washington are staying. So to Eric's point, a huge challenge here must be having that level of separation between regular guests at the hotel and those who are attending.
There was actually a woman with her hair in a towel and slippers as several of the people were coming in the door. Yeah, because she's looking for her key.
I have no doubt. It's a hotel in central D.C. for our listeners who are listening from outside of this town. It's a storied hotel in that it is also the hotel where President Reagan was shot.
Back in 81.
Back in 81. Sometimes it's referred to as the Hinckley Hilton because of the assailant at that time. But that's also an important point because the security measures for a president, any president, at that hotel are particularly high. the year that I was the president of the White House Correspondents Association, President Trump didn't come, but we were in the area backstage and in a waiting room. I got to see where there's a special entrance that was created for presidents to come through that is secure. And that entrance was created after the Reagan shooting. So there's a special area. That's one reason why the association continues to have its dinner there every year. It's number one, because of the security protocols, and number two, because of that large space.
There's also, that is the reason we have the White House pool system, is because of that shooting. Because when Reagan was shot, there were not all the cameras there. It used to not be, we all travel with the president, we take turns. That used to not exist. When Reagan was shot, not everyone was there. So after that, all the networks wanted to follow the president all the time, and it became overwhelming. Jeff, check me if I'm wrong. It became overwhelming for the president to kind of manage, and so they worked out this deal, this pool rotation system. But that, my understanding, is the precipitating incident.
I think it goes back a little earlier than that, but certainly
okay.
that was an example of a time when the pool was there. I mean, one piece of the pool responsibility is just to be there in case something like this, God forbid, ever happens again.
Jeff, very quickly here, there was a lot of resonance to what's happened in years past. Butler came up during that briefing that the president gave yesterday. Talk a bit about that. It's something that perhaps we all thought of in that moment, that this is a president who has lived through something like this before.
Sure. I would say a couple things. Number one, we don't know the motive of the shooter yet. I mean, it's possible that he was there wanting to shoot the President of the United States. It's also possible that he knew it was a room full of journalists and wanted to take on that crowd. We just don't know. But it's absolutely spot on to say that this president has faced a couple assassination attempts since the campaign, and that one being, of course, the biggest one in Butler, where two other people were shot and killed, and he was injured on one of his ears. Then there was someone who was apprehended at his Mar-a-Lago estate at his golf course, rather, in Florida. And he was asked about that last night, and he used that question to say that he felt that he was targeted because of the impact of his presidency and the things that he was doing. He also talked about the need for a White House ballroom. So he brought politics into that very extraordinary press conference last night that he held after this shooting.
Guys are going to come back, I know, over the course of the next few hours. Jeff Mason, Eric Martin, thank you both for joining us on the heels of this event last night in Washington, D.C. Coming up here on Bloomberg this weekend, what else do we know about that suspect set to appear in court on Monday, facing federal charges brought here in Washington, D.C.? We're going to get into that straight ahead on Bloomberg this weekend, on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. Stay with us.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Week, and I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. And the investigation continues after an alleged gunman opened fire at the White House Correspondents' dinner in Washington, D.C. last night, forcing President Donald Trump to be rushed from the stage and the event to be postponed. Now, authorities say Cole Thomas Allen of California, he was a guest at the hotel. He's being charged with using a firearm in a crime of violence and assaulting a federal officer with a dangerous weapon. Jeffrey Carroll, Metropolitan Police Department interim chief, described the scene.
We know the individual charged the checkpoint with a firearm in his hand. We know he was running in the direction of the ballroom that the president was in, as well as other cabinet members. So what his specific motivation was, we can't say at this point.
Now, despite the chaos, President Trump says the event will return.
We'll do it again within the next 30 days, and we'll make it bigger and better and even nicer.
In other news, a planned trip to Pakistan by President Trump's top envoys has been canceled. The president on Saturday, he told his son-in-law Jared Kushner and special envoy Steve Witkoff to skip the trip, adding in a social media post that there's been too much time wasted on traveling. Now, meanwhile, Iran's top diplomat left Islamabad ahead of the planned arrival of the U.S. envoys. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi met with mediators in Pakistan, calling his visit, quote, very fruitful, but said Iran has yet to see if the U.S. is truly serious about diplomacy. Christina and David.
Lisa, thank you very much. Well, the suspect in last night's shooting has been identified as 31-year-old Cole Allen. According to reports, he traveled across the country from Southern California to that dinner to target Trump administration officials.
Bloomberg's Jeff Mason is back with us, along with Elliot Williams. He's a CNN legal analyst and former federal prosecutor. He's also the author of a new book, 5 Bullets, chronicling one of New York City's most infamous shooting. Thank you guys both so much for joining us. Elliot, I want to ask you At the moment, this individual, as far as we know, is only charged with gun-related charges. Are we expecting that will be upgraded as the facts become clear? How does this work?
I would think it would be upgraded if more facts come out that give a sense as to why the shooting took place. Now, if you notice, the two crimes, Christina, that they've identified really are quite specific to just simply having a firearm, assaulting a federal officer, someone goes after an officer, but also using a firearm in the commission of a crime of violence. Those are two things that are obvious to anybody that's on the video. Right now, no one knows if he attempted to kill the president legally. No one knows who he went there to kill or assault. And until you know that information, you can't really charge him with those things. There are federal crimes for attempting to kill a president of the United States, a vice president, a member of Congress. None of that has come out yet.
Give us some sense of what's happening at this point in time. So we heard from Kash Patel, the head of the FBI. We heard from the acting attorney general last night as well, talking a bit about the contours of this investigation. What's happening behind the scenes, and what is that interface like between Main Justice, U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro's office, and the FBI as well?
Right. Certainly the FBI would be leading any investigation here because, and the Secret Service too, for a few reasons. FBI handles general violent crime at a federal level, but also acts of terrorism. And if there is some terrorist nexus, that would make it squarely within the FBI's purview. So they're looking into that. I think the FBI is gathering the kinds of things that I was talking about here, which would be, why did this person commit this thing? Now, you can get that just from searching his person. Is there a manifesto somewhere? What does he say in his emails? What is the record of his staying at that hotel, getting to the hotel? What can they piece together about why he was there? It's very easy, particularly in a morning like this where feelings are raw, for people to think, oh, this person must have gone to try to kill the president of the United States or commit a terrorist act. And it seems obvious, right? We saw on the television, and I think that's a natural conclusion. But prosecutors can only charge what they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And right now, at least based on what I'm reading in the newspapers and seeing on the television, it's a person with a gun at a big event
where the president
was, but that discharged his weapon perhaps in a violent manner. Or in a violent manner, of course.
What is the legal threshold to upgrade those charges? What are they looking for?
Yeah, it's not a question of even upgrading them. It's the same standard every time.
Adding to?
Yeah, or just adding new charges. It would be, do you have probable cause to believe that this crime was committed? Probable cause being it's more likely than not. So do they have evidence to suggest that there's a decent chance that any of these things happen? Now, that's just the threshold for charging. Convicting him is beyond a reasonable doubt. We've all heard that in cop shows through our whole lives. And are they convinced? And prosecutors can't and shouldn't, frankly, even with respect to their law licenses, can't bring charges that they don't believe they can win beyond a reasonable doubt. So, yes, I think we think of prosecutors as just, I was going to say shooting into the air. That's maybe not the right metaphor to use here. But you think of prosecutors as blindly going after charges simply because to go after someone. No, they have to really be convinced and confident that they can win if they bring this to trial.
Jeff, let's talk a bit about the tableau that we saw last night, which was so striking. That was the White House briefing room full of reporters in tuxedos and evening gowns, the president wearing a tuxedo as well. And as I mentioned, you had Todd Blanche there with Kash Patel. What stood out to you from their remarks as they talked about what had happened in the investigation? Kash Patel talking a lot about the success of law enforcement at this moment and them being emboldened or helped or encouraged by what the president has done. What stood out to you from the comments that they made, those law enforcement officials made during their comments last night?
A handful of things. Number one, it was all staged, and that is, it was staged in real time. That's not a criticism, but that's very Trumpian. The president leaving the ballroom and then going straight to the White House and holding a press conference. And he talked
with many cabinet members present.
And his wife.
Yes. Also
unusual. And he answered reporters' questions. He talked about his feelings in the moment. But he also, as I referred to in the previous block, brought in a little bit of politics, brought in this sort of push for the new ballroom, which I can tell you, as a former White House president, Correspondents Association president, we wouldn't be planning an event in the White House ballroom unless that was directed perhaps by the Secret Service. So I understand that he's been making that case for the ballroom, which is caught up in the legal system right now for state dinners. But it was a first to hear him make an argument that you needed the ballroom for an event planned by an outside organization. But to your broader question, you also heard Kash Patel, as he often does, begin his opening remarks when he was given the podium last night praising President Trump. So lots of little pieces of politics and praise for the president who may or may not have been facing a third assassination attempt.
Elliot, what's your take on that? Should the Secret Service be able to secure an external ballroom, or does the president need to retreat behind those gates on Pennsylvania Avenue?
Oh, my goodness. There are such long-standing procedures with respect to how to secure a space. I think one of the issues that they confronted here is the fact that this event, and this is touching on what Jeff was talking about a little bit, this event takes place in a hotel with residents that have nothing to do with this event, and to some extent people have a right, or at least ought to have the ability to come and go from the place they're staying. That said, the President of the United States gets 24-hour Secret Service protection, and as we see from events like this, sometimes that breaks down, at least to us as lay people out in the public. There has to be a balance somehow where we secure the president and the people around him and the people who are entitled to legal protection under the law, but also that Americans can go about and live their lives freely. And I think that's what they run into, having this event in a regular hotel that's open to the streets. You can just walk in.
Yeah, and it has, as I was saying before, it has the biggest ballroom in Washington, D.C., and a ballroom in an area that has been a historically very safe place for presidents and leaders. This is also where the National Prayer Breakfast is held every year. Right. I have to assume after last night that there are going to be lots and lots of questions about that hotel specifically and the security protocols for holding events, not just like the White House Correspondents Association last night that we were at, but also other events like the prayer breakfast and other things.
But just quickly, as a matter of common sense, again, none of us are Secret Service agents here. I've dealt with law enforcement for much of my career, but as a matter of common sense, the idea that the ballroom was secured, but someone could still get into the hotel, yes, that probably fits protocol and makes sense. But just thinking about it as well.
And we want to have you in just a sec. We've got live photos of the suspect's house in Torrance, California, and I do want you to look at this footage that's coming up and talk a little bit about what folks are looking for. But also to that point, and Jeff, you know this too, when you travel, and you do as well, I mean, you've been around these trips, when you travel with the president abroad, he stays at hotels. Other people can stay at those hotels. But that perimeter is pushed way out. You cannot get into that hotel without going through a mag, even if you are just a guest staying there. I've never seen that here. But when you're overseas, that is always the protocol, because it's a pain and you don't want to stay at that hotel because you don't want to go in and out. And I wonder if that's what we see if they do this again, is that perimeter is going to get pushed way out.
Right. And I think, I worked at the Department of Homeland Security for several years. I think we're constantly chasing the last vulnerability and the last problem. And I would think that the problem they fix now is, wait a second, people are getting too close to the President of the United States. And now we need to, whenever he's in a hotel, extend the perimeter a little bit more. It's tragic in many ways that it requires a vulnerability breach to fix the problem, but that's sort of what will happen next. I'm certain we're going to see something out of this.
I think your point is spot on. I mean, and that is absolutely true domestically as well when you're traveling with the president. If you're in San Francisco, if you're in New York, the hotel that you're staying at with, in our case, is often the press pool, is very frequently at the same hotel as the President of the United States. You can't get into the building without going through the magnetometer. So it raises the question about the security parameters at this hotel, not just last night, but in previous nights as well. And I think also worth explaining to people that the ballroom is on the very lowest level in the Hinckley Hilton, in the Washington Hilton. You have to go down, I think it's 3 floors. You have to go down 2 sets of staircases, or
it's at least 2 escalators.
Escalators is the word I was looking for.
I gotcha.
And so this person would have had to go down that many levels with what reportedly was a shotgun, a handgun, and multiple knives. That, I don't know if he had it in a backpack or in some sort of a bag, but the fact, again, that he got as far as he did before he was apprehended is something that people are going to be asking questions about.
I've got about a minute left here before the break, but I'm curious what the investigation looks like, both within that hotel, in that ballroom today, and also as we see these videos of Torrance, California, the house of the suspect. What law enforcement's doing there, and who indeed is in charge? Is it D.C. police? Is it the FBI? Who's leading all of this?
I think that there's probably a task force of them working together. I would think the FBI is leading it, but again, I can't speak for how they're proceeding. The evidence in the room is probably the least interesting evidence, because you see it's either firearms or casings, anything like that. The interesting materials will be at his house and on his computers. We live in a world right now where everything is electronic. Receipts for purchases for those firearms, are going to be looking for those. They'll be looking for statements, emails, text messages, none of which lie. There's perpetual record of someone's communications with others, and those, at least in the world we live in today, are hugely important bits of evidence. And I know they're scouring for those at his house right now.
Search history. All right, Elliot Williams, Jeff Mason, stick with us. We'll come back. Excuse me. We're all struggling a little bit this morning. We're going to come back to you guys shortly. Escalators. It's a hard word. Yeah. Elliot's book, of course, is titled 5 Bullets, The Story of Bernie Goetz, and we're going to talk about that here in a bit. Another major event is set to take place this week in Washington, and that is the first state visit from King Charles. Will we see any changes to security? All the things we've been talking about, many of those events set to take place at the same places we have been this week. There were parties at the British Embassy. A lot of these venues are standard venues to host important people and fancy parties, and a lot of the same people, including a lot of folks here in Bloomberg, will be at those same events. It's going to be interesting to see how they change.
A huge multi-day event with the king here in Washington, traveling to New York as well. So as you mentioned, Christina, there are going to be events here in the city, at the White House as well. The president going up, I think, to Harlem to visit a neighborhood there as well. So back and forth, and it is an open question, I think, sort of what happened in D.C. last night colors the way that trip is going to be arranged and how it's going to play out. We still don't have a guest list, for instance, for that state dinner.
No, and as you mentioned, Prince Charles has a lot of internal travel plans, and we'll have to see if they scale that back given everything that's going on and where the resources are. We provide for those visiting diplomats with U.S. assistance, and they may not have the bandwidth to facilitate a trip like that at this time. We'll have to see what happens.
Our coverage is going to continue here in just a moment on Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg.com. It's Bloomberg This Weekend. Stay with us.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. And gunfire erupted. It's disrupted President Donald Trump's first appearance as president at the White House Correspondents' dinner in Washington last night. And Secret Service officers, they rushed into the room to evacuate President Trump, the First Lady, Vice President J.D. Vance, and cabinet officials. While attendees, they were ducking under tables to take shelter. Janine Pirro, she's a U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia. She says the suspect, Cole Thomas Allen, is being charged with 2 felonies.
Right now, the defendant is being charged with 2 counts, 924C, using a firearm during a crime of violence, and a second crime under 111, which is assault on a federal officer using a dangerous weapon.
Authorities say the suspect was taken to a local hospital to be evaluated and is expected to be arraigned on Monday. President Trump said that a motive is unclear, but it is believed to be a lone wolf incident. Now, in other news, a ceasefire in limbo after President Trump canceled a planned trip by his top envoys for negotiations over the Iran conflict. And Iran's top diplomat met mediators in Pakistan and left Islamabad well ahead of the planned arrival of U.S. envoys. Now, despite Iran tensions, King Charles III will follow his mother's lead in celebrating U.S. and U.K. relations. King Charles and Queen Camilla will begin their 4-day trip tomorrow when they will have tea with the President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump. And the formal arrival ceremony will take place on Tuesday, but no word if this has all changed in lieu of all of yesterday's events in D.C. Christina and David, we will keep you updated on that.
Thanks, Lisa. World leaders are posting on social media overnight and early this morning condemning the violence at last night's White House Correspondents' dinner and voicing relief that President Trump and guests are now safe. Joining us now, Michelle Hussein from The Michelle Hussein Show, and of course, Bloomberg News State Department reporter Eric Martin is back with us on set. Michelle, we were originally having you on to talk Iran and a couple other things, including the state visit with King Charles coming. I know you've been talking to sources in the UK about whether or not they're possibly changing the agenda for that. But first, I just want to talk to you. I mean, was this the first time you've been in that kind of situation? I know this is something people from abroad see happening often in America. And did you think you'd ever experience that yourself?
It was really uncanny to be under the tables in the eerie stillness of that room, as all of us were last night with so many others, and all the thoughts that go through your head at that moment. But absolutely, as an outsider to the United States, someone who doesn't live here, I was thinking, like, there are people in this room who have been through these kinds of situations in drills, in school, in other ways.
And possibly more than one. You had a lot of people who were January 6th, a lot of people who were at Butler. Yeah,
absolutely. And I was really conscious that, whatever was happening, as we now know, actually outside the doors of the room that we were in, the nature of the United States, and particularly a place where the president is, that there would be many other guns in the room. So I was absolutely conscious that there was the possibility of some kind of crossfire, and that was why we were down where we were, because that's immediately what comes to your mind, that this is a country where there will be many weapons potentially around. So, yeah, it was that kind of thing that was going through my mind. And, you know, we were sitting close to British diplomats who were immediately thinking about the implications for the visit of the King. His Majesty is due to fly in tomorrow morning. So in a visit that was already complicated for other reasons we can discuss, but which now has this added level of having to look again at security.
Michael Grimbaum in the Times had a phrase, the nauseating silence of what happened afterward. And it was a very strange, as we've talked about, moment when the room got quiet as security made its way up to the front of the room. Eric Michel's bringing up the fact that we had a lot of diplomats there at the dinner last night. There were representatives of various embassies throughout the city. Talk a bit about that. Just we've seen reaction from international leaders thus far, but this was a moment when we had a kind of broader international community gathered in the room as well, not just members of Congress and journalists and members of the administration, but a good diplomatic corps as well.
Absolutely. This kind of incident obviously is not unique to the U.S., but we sure seem to have it more than any place else in the world. We have some statistics that we were looking at. I know 120 mass shootings, at least, in the U.S. so far this year. And we've also seen some statements coming in, statements of support and compassion and identification from leaders elsewhere in the world that have experienced political violence. We saw a statement from Prime Minister Netanyahu, obviously in recent years, and kind of perennially Israel is under threat. And the Prime Minister talking about the shock of himself and his wife, Sarah, in terms of what happened last night. Israel obviously also looming large with the recent example, the recent experience of October 7th of 2023. Also, the president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, expressing her concern and her sending her well wishes to the American president and to everyone who was there. Mexico has had less at a national level, but certainly at a local and regional level, Mexico has experienced a lot of political violence and assassinations of leaders. So these statements of support and coming in from across the world. Even last night in the minutes I was following on social media on X, and all of these statements that were coming out in real time, leaders reacting and sending that support to Washington and to everyone who was affected by this.
I hope it's okay to say, but the Canadian ambassador was at our table in a lovely, classy, very Canadian move. As everybody was getting released and we were realizing we could leave, he said, I'm gonna order some pizzas, and if you guys want to come back to the embassy, we can just like chill and decompress, and you can come over for some pizzas. It was a very lovely, diplomatic and very Canadian.
Quite revealing to see different people's reactions. You know, some much more alarmed, some much more stoic. But I was really thinking as we gathered last night that despite this really tense international moment and tense also in the relationship between politics and the press, you know, we were all wondering at the start of the evening, what is the president going to say?
Everybody was, yeah.
But yet in the room, it is an extraordinary coming together, maybe unique. I mean, we certainly don't really have anything like that in the UK, but the fact that these members of the cabinet are across the room, invited guests at different tables, invited by different news organizations, and you have guests from the world of business, you have the diplomatic corps as well. So it's like this really extraordinary gathering, and then it ends up being extraordinary for a completely different and really quite chilling way.
Talk a bit about this royal visit and sort of what your expectations are for it, the reason that it's happening now, and as we see a less than good relationship, I think, between the president and the prime minister, his affection for the royal family, the president's affection for the royal family has been palpable over these last many years. This is an important visit for him, for the president. I'm curious how, from the other side of the Atlantic, they're viewing this moment.
Well, it's not that long since we had President Trump's unprecedented second state visit to the UK, right? So we've had a few interactions, the late Queen, this King, and now the King coming here. The reason for the visit is the forthcoming 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So it is that which was the spur for it. But of course, it's coming at a moment moment where not only the United States is engaged in conflict, even though we are in a ceasefire period at the moment, but also he has been very, very rude about the Prime Minister and about UK military capability and about the UK in general at that time. So in that sense, from the UK government and diplomacy's point of view, it's welcome to have a kind of moment which reminds the president that there is at least a special relationship for him personally with the United States because of his mother's, with the United Kingdom because of his mother's heritage, and the idea that in the period that the King's here, that he can do some of that diplomatic work. And frankly, he's been a diplomat all his life. But on top of that, it's also personally, there is an awkwardness for the King because of the call for him to meet Epstein survivors and the connection that his brother had with the late Jeffrey Epstein. So there are all those layers that make this a tricky visit in many ways. It's going to be a short visit, and everyone involved will be hoping that it goes off completely smoothly.
We have to go to break, but I do want to ask you very quickly in about 30 seconds, what is the King's security? I apologize that I don't know. I know they do have security, but is it a Secret Service equivalent? And when they're here, are they going to be relying a lot on U.S. assets?
I think the way it works in any host country is that the host country is in the forefront. I think it's a bit different for Americans when the American president goes elsewhere.
Like
it's clearly
they bring their own guys. They bring the vehicles.
But normally it's the other way around.
All right. Thank you so much, Eric Martin. Thank you for being here. Michelle, you're going to come back after the break to discuss some of the other stories still unfolding, including the war in Iran and your interview with Wendy Sherman, the lead negotiator of the first Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which we've been talking about as nauseum, and I know you can help us break it down. We really appreciate it. That's coming up next on Bloomberg This Weekend on all the platforms, radio, TV, streaming. We will be right here. Stick with us. Be right back. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini here, of course, with David Gura. Last night, after the shooting incident at the Hilton Ballroom here in Washington, D.C., President Trump ruled out a connection to Iran, with that war nearing its 2-month mark.
Ceasefire talks between the U.S. and Iran were scrapped this weekend once again. Michelle Hussein spoke with Wendy Sherman, the lead negotiator of the 2015 first Iran nuclear deal, about her concerns over the way peace talks are playing out.
Right now, all I see is a disequilibrium. What I mean by that is some broad outline where folks are going to have to spend quite a long time making sure the details undergird that broad outline. And while all of that happens, my guess is that Iran will still have some measure of control over the strait. What will happen to that stockpile of highly enriched uranium? It's not like you can resolve that in a day. It is a complex, tedious operation under very difficult security arrangements.
Buried underground?
Buried underground, deep underground. We've done things like this before in Kazakhstan, but we did it with Kazakhstan's working with us. And I don't know how anyone will feel secure doing this with Iran. So there's so much to work out here, Michelle. I worry about the administration's ability to do it, since I don't think they've brought the technical expertise to the table. In the last round in Islamabad, I was glad to see that Vice President Vance brought some experts with him. But I'm not sure any of them were in any of the rooms. I'm not sure they were really working on everything that was needed to be done. And none of this is achieved by one person or even 3 negotiators, the Vice President Witkoff and Kushner. I had a core team of 15. I had the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Energy, who was a nuclear physicist who was brilliant. I had nuclear physicists and sanctions experts and lawyers and Treasury folks on my team. I had people who spoke fluent Persian on my team, Farsi as some people call it. I had literally hundreds in the U.S. government who were engaged in this. All of our national labs, all of our nuclear labs, who could do the exquisite calculations that are necessary to know whether you've got what you think you've got. I don't see any of that infrastructure here. to be able to get this job done.
All right, Michelle is back with us. This is something we've been talking a lot about with our guests, is how these talks actually happen, how they are executed, and when they are successful, the framework that is required for that. If they do manage to restart these negotiations, how do you see that all playing out, and how was she able to enlighten us?
So I think when Wendy Sherman lets us into that world of the negotiation, particularly on exactly this front, you realize the gap between the level of detail and engagement that is required and the kind of diplomacy that has happened so far, and that hopefully at some point will happen again in Islamabad, where the administration is looking for a quick fix, is looking for a quick win, and Iran is in it for the long haul. And the actual issues of substance are difficult and complex and detailed. So I think there you already see the gap in appetite, as well as perhaps the gap in capacity for detail. But I think when it gets down to it, look, the issue's on the table. There's the actual stockpile of enriched uranium, which is buried underground. Would Iran ever agree to that being removed from the country? Then there is the issue about some kind of time frame or moratorium on the enrichment of further uranium. But then you have the wild card of the Strait of Hormuz and this extra weapon, if you like, that Iran has discovered and deployed in these last 8 weeks. So what is the kind of arrangement or commitment that Iran would give to keep that open, and what would it want in return for that? Presumably sanctions relief. Yeah. So in some ways what the US will have to get into is a repeat of what Wendy Sherman worked on, and in other ways it's really hard to imagine that kind of long, detailed negotiation. But I think one thing that really struck me, and Wendy Sherman kind of acknowledged this but didn't really want to describe it in the way I did, is that JCPOA, there was a big part of it that was a secret back channel between the US and Iran, which was kept to the Europeans didn't know. Wendy Sherman was the one who eventually had to go to Brussels and say, by the way, guys, we have been negotiating directly with Iran for more than a year and you guys didn't know about it. So
we have about a minute left, and something that was fascinating to me was her commentary on the interpersonal relationships between her, a diplomat, and the Iranians as well. And we saw that she was in such constant contact with Javad Zarif, the former foreign minister. What insight did she have into the degree to which each side has to trust the other? She said that she didn't trust the Iranians. She didn't,
and I thought that was interesting because trust is a word that comes up a lot in negotiations, but actually she's saying it's more like you have to understand each other. You have to understand that however unequal the negotiation is, and it was unequal then and it will be unequal whenever it happens in earnest, still the other side, in this case Iran, wants to get something. So if you're not willing to give them anything, then it's not a negotiation. Then you're back to the world of force and force alone.
It's very pragmatic. Yeah, she said it was about respect, almost. I couldn't remember what the exact quote was, but it was.
You have to understand where they are coming from. That they have interest just as you have interest, and if you can't acknowledge that, then it's a non-starter.
It's a fascinating conversation. I think what comes across as well, Christina, we've talked about this too, is just the amount of time and engagement. Yes, the level of technical expertise that was involved, but also the commitment that Wendy Sherman and others made to being in Geneva, being in Switzerland.
People decamped in Geneva for a really long time.
So this notion that this could be solved quickly with a flight to Pakistan over a weekend seems a bit like folly given what we've seen in the past, but certainly what we'll be watching for. And again, the interview is terrific. Michelle Hussein, host of the Michelle Hussein Show, editor-at-large for Bloomberg Weekend. Thank you very much for joining us here on set in D.C.
Thank you so much. All right, we're coming up on 8 a.m. here in Washington.
Our coverage of what happened last night at the White House Correspondents Association dinner is going to continue as we dig into what we know of the suspect and what we know of what happened there last night as the salad course was served and everyone was squired out of that ballroom. The next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend starts right now on Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, and on Bloomberg.com.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. It is 8 a.m. here in D.C. We are broadcasting this weekend from Bloomberg Studios in the nation's capital. I'm Christina Ruffini, along with David Gura and Lisa Mateo.
Our focus this morning, yes, on what we were just talking about, the state of these negotiations between the U.S. and the Iranians, but much more acutely now, what happened last night at the White House Correspondents Association dinner in Washington, D.C. The three of us were in attendance there, along with many of our Bloomberg colleagues, and to get everyone up to speed, shots were fired early on in that dinner. The president, the vice president, many members of his cabinet ushered out of that building, the president giving a statement afterward at the White House about what had happened. We know that a suspect has been apprehended from California, but still, the uncertainty that followed in the immediate aftermath of that shooting remains. There's a lot that we still don't know.
And ongoing. I mean, we are assuming a motive, but to what we were talking about earlier, they haven't charged him with that yet, so that means that they haven't proven that.
Two charges to come on Monday. Both of which have to do with guns.
Weapons charges, because that is, the clearest thing that they can get before investigating this more. But we need to know more about this subject. And the other big question is basically, how did this happen? And that's something that we think we're going to be talking about a lot here in Washington and throughout the week.
At least we were sitting near each other, and it was just a startling moment.
It was amazing. It was. And hearing the stories of everyone we've had on this morning of exactly what happened, from people ducking under tables to the confusion to the fear in people's faces. I saw one woman in tears. So it's an example of what can happen in this type of situation, that people were just confused and didn't know where to go and what to turn and what to do. All
right, we've got some sound and some video. We're going to kind of run everybody through what happened.
As the president was having his mind read by the evening's entertainment, several thuds could be heard in the ballroom. Initially, neither the president nor the guests took much notice. Then, a column of security, Secret Service, and tactical teams swarmed the ballroom. The vice president and president were quickly whisked off stage, followed by the president of the White House press corps, Weijia Zhang. Secret Service jumped tables and flipped chairs to rush cabinet members, including Stephen Miller and a pregnant Katie Miller, out a side door. The Speaker of the House was rushed through the lobby. Cabinet secretaries were extracted from their tables, while ambassadors, VIPs, and guests sheltered under them. Journalists ducked for cover while trying to record on their phones. Guests who weren't evacuated were asked to wait. But with an active crime scene just outside the ballroom door, the president instead called a press conference at the White House.
Can you describe what was going through your mind, how you were feeling in that moment?
That's a very good question, actually. It's always shocking when something like this happens. It's happened to me a little bit, and that never changes. The fact, we were sitting right next to each other, the First Lady on my right, and I heard a noise and sort of thought it was a tray. I thought it was a tray going down. I've heard that many times, and it was a pretty loud noise. And it was from quite far away. He hadn't breached the area at all. They really got him. But so it was quite far away, but it was a gun. And some people really understood that pretty quickly. Other people didn't. I was watching to see what was happening. Probably should have gone down even faster.
Back at the Hilton, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, Mayor of D.C., and Chief of Police held a press conference.
I'm not exactly 100% familiar with this building. I do know in this incident tonight, I know there was a security plan that was developed by the Secret Service that the Metropolitan Police Department assisted with, and I know that security plan did work this evening.
Leaving many unanswered questions, an empty ballroom, and visibly shaken staff left to clean up the mess.
On this Sunday morning, we have Joe Matthew, the co-anchor of Bloomberg's Balance of Power, with us, and Jeff Mason back with us as well. Yes, a White House correspondent here at Bloomberg News, but also a former president of the White House Correspondents Association. Joe, great to have you with us here on this Sunday, and I would be very eager to get your sense of what transpired yesterday. As I said, there was a great element of confusion as all of this unfolded. I think from where I was seated, where Eric Martin was seated, we did hear these shots very clearly. For those like you, closer to the stage, down in the well of this giant ballroom in Washington, D.C., compounding the confusion was, I think it was largely inaudible, those shots.
Well, it's interesting the way the president described it, because I actually thought, and we all thought the same thing, it sounded like something had crashed to the floor, like a tray went down or something, and there was a couple of... But once you started seeing people dive to the floor and you realized something had gone wrong, it was interesting how long the president was left at the dais. They whisked J.D. Vance pretty quickly, and the president was still talking to Weijia Zhang as if nothing had happened. And pretty quickly, everyone was dispatched. But to see the Secret Service running across the tops of tables was not only dramatic, but remarkable to watch how they identified the location of each cabinet official in the room. They practically lifted RFK Jr. and Scott Bessent off their feet to get them out of there. And it was pretty remarkable. I know there's going to be a whole conversation about the way this went and whether security was effective. But if you were sitting in the room, it was quite impressive to watch.
And we had line of sight from where we were of Stephen Miller, and Katie Miller, his wife, is pregnant. And one of our other colleagues, I think from CBS, had a video that was closer where almost immediately, to your point, Joe, while they were waiting to find a line of egress out of the room, because as we've discussed, those are not clear traffic paths, and Secret Service was throwing chairs to make that happen.
That's right.
A Secret Service agent, I'm assuming, had arms on both of them and then was huddled and said, wait, wait, wait. And then when they cleared, They ran out the side door that was closest to my table, and someone nearby, I don't know who, did shout, "Stephen, can we go with you?" So that was an interesting moment.
Todd Blanche, the acting attorney general, on Meet the Press this morning, and the Associated Press writing up the interview that's taking place right now. And the information that we're getting from that interview is the gunman who tried to breach the ballroom at the White House Correspondents Association dinner, believed to have been targeting members of the Trump administration. That, according again to the acting attorney general, Todd Blanche, also saying officials believe the suspect traveled by train from California to Chicago and then on to Washington, where, as we talked about over the course of the last hour, he checked in as a guest at that hotel at the Hilton, where, as the AP puts it, one of Washington's glitziest events was being held on Saturday night. Jeff, your reaction to that? I mean, we learned in broad strokes here information about the suspect last night, but as we've said, a lot that we still don't know about who this individual is.
Indeed, and that's something that we'll be asking.
Hang on just a sec, Jeff. We're going to go to, we're fixing your mic. Your mic is not currently on, so I'm being told to ask you to pause.
Sure.
But I mean, Joe, you can talk about this too.
It's not your doing.
I would never, ever mute Jeff Mason's mic. I'm sorry, Jeff, we can't hear you because obviously your mic is muted. So, we'll just pivot right to Joe. Joe, the other thing that I noticed, I don't know how long you hung around, as we were leaving and most of us had left, and Jeff, if his mic ever works, can talk about this again too, is it's not just us. There's a huge back of house staff that makes that dinner possible.
Oh, my God.
And they, by some reports, were very close to where this action all went down. They were told to put their hands up, which we really were not. And I was watching the aftermath, and these caterers and the staff try to clear these tables, and some of their hands were shaking. Right. And I just went up to these two women and I said, "Are you okay?" And they said, "Thank you so much for asking." Got teary because it's not just... Journalists love to talk about ourselves, and we should stop doing that. But it's not just us that is going to be impacted by this, and I think they had a much harder night than a lot of us did.
Well, that's right. I mean, look, there are thousands of people in that room. In fact, they've been packing more seats in there over the past 20 years than maybe some feel is appropriate, and maybe that's going to be reconsidered. I was listening on the way into your conversation with Jeff, who referred to this, and I don't know if you did it on purpose, Jeff, as the Hinckley Hilton, which is what we all call that hotel here in Washington. I used to live on the block on Vernon Street, right behind that hotel, and I think you live pretty close to there, Miss Ruffini. And there's a plaque that was put up on the wall right at the base of the hotel where the assassination attempt of Ronald Reagan took place. This was within feet of that happening. And when you consider the history of this room now and what might come next, maybe it's not a mystery why the president's talking about a ballroom at the White House to better secure these types of activities.
Jeff, pick up that, because that wasn't a moment that struck me as a bit odd in the course of him recounting what had happened to him over the course of the dinner. He has made many justifications for the construction of the ballroom on the White House grounds. This was a novel turn, I thought, during the president's remarks last night, that what happened last night is a proof of concept for there needing to be a space that can accommodate maybe not 2,900 people as the Hilton one does, as you pointed out.
2,600, but
2,600, corrected. But needs to have a space like that at the White House. What did you make of the president kind of wading into those waters last night?
I mean, I've covered the president a long time. He uses any opportunity that he can get to make an argument for things that he cares about. And this is one of the things that he really cares about right now, is that ballroom, which is tied up in the courts after he knocked down the entire east wing of the White House and decided to build this ballroom without getting additional permission. So he's been talking about that. He's talked about the fact that there are additional security not really protocols, but security measures that would be put into place with having that ballroom. But it's not a public space, that ballroom, if and when it gets built. This is a public space where an outside organization, in this case, the White House Correspondents Association, which I used to lead, plans the dinner. So it's not an apples for apples comparison, but it was something that he used when speaking at the press room or speaking in the press room as an opportunity to talk about it.
Joe, this was our colleague Michelle Hussein's first one of these dinners. She's coming over from the UK, and she was talking about how there was this brief moment of unity after the silence, or during the silence, when all these different people, administration officials, diplomats, journalists, were all kind of in the same boat. Yeah. The irony for me there is, that this dinner is supposed to do exactly that. For all its controversy and its distractors, the idea is to get all these people in the room, have a laugh, have some common ground, and kind of have a better working relationship. What does this do for that relationship? What does this incident do for any of this?
I'm not sure that changes. There are you've got the dinner on a Saturday night, but as you know, and I don't know if you've had a chance to sleep since you've been in Washington this week, there are many days of events that surround it, and that's including this day. There are a series of brunches that a lot of the folks in that room will be attending, and I don't know, maybe this brings people ever closer together. There's a shared experience now, obviously, that we would not have had before. But we'll see where that goes. We're in a time of war right now with a heightened urgency around domestic terror threats. And so let's see where this conversation goes in the next couple of days. I will say that someone is going to write a remarkable story about what happens to the 3,000 steaks that were about to come out in the dining room last night. You talk about the service staff. There was a massive dinner that was about to be served, and I hope some charity in Washington is doing better for it today.
Yeah. Jeff, there is always an argument, you're familiar with it, that this dinner shouldn't take place. You were the president of this organization. You had to engage with those who say, look, this is, as Joe's pointed out, a much larger event than it was in the past. Maybe it's too glitzy. It's moved beyond just elevating the First Amendment. It's become something perhaps untoward in the eyes of others. What do you say to that and square that with what we heard from the president, from the current president of the association last night, that this is going to not only happen next year, but they intend to have this within the next 30 days, a redux of the dinner that we had last night?
Well, and to be clear, it was the president of the United States who said he wanted that to happen again within 30 days. Yeah. We'll see if that's possible logistically, but this is a President Trump, who has not been supportive of that dinner. And the year that I was president in 2017 was the first time that a president hadn't attended it in 30 years, since President Reagan had been shot.
Was that a surprise to you? Just to interrupt quickly, I mean, as you say, he didn't go during his first term. This was the first time he intended to go. How did that kind of shape your sense of the dinner, not having a president willing to go to it?
Well, the dinner has always been about press freedom, but I really recast it the year that I was planning it to be focused on the First Amendment. There's a toast at the dinner, which of course didn't happen last night, that used to be a toast to the president.
You had a First Amendment lapel pin on.
I did,
last night.
And those were pins that I gave out during my year as president. We changed the toast in 2017 to a toast to the First Amendment. I don't know what the toast was going to be last night, but I presume it was going to continue in that tradition. So it is a dinner about the First Amendment, about press freedom. It's an opportunity to give out scholarship money to students and also to give awards to members of the Washington Press Corps who do really excellent work. But you're spot on to say that there's controversy around it. That people show up, as we all did last night, in glitzy clothing and sit down and break bread with members of the administration, whether it's Democratic or Republican, with lawmakers. And the Correspondents Association, which I no longer wear a hat to represent, but I can speak broadly to, sees it as an opportunity to show that these two sides, the press and the people we are covering, can come together and break bread one evening.
Literally.
Literally one evening of the year. And it was remarkable that President Trump was coming to it last night because of his history. But to pick up on your question to Joe as well, he referenced that a little bit in the press room last night. By saying that the speech that he was given is not one that he could now give. And I think we were all eager to see what sort of a speech it was going to be.
Very.
But that was conciliatory. He was very complimentary of Weijia Chang from the podium, and apparently rode with her in the limousine, or invited her to ride with him in the limousine on the way back to the White House.
Amazing. She's an outstanding colleague. I worked with her for CBS many years. None better. Joe, I do want to pick up on what Jeff was saying about the First Amendment, because sometimes in conflict with the First Amendment is the Second Amendment. And at that press conference, we have President Trump talking about how no country is immune from political violence.
Yeah, we're not the only country. You look at this great violence with all countries. I was talking to somebody from another country today, and they have numerous assassinations of political figures all over the world. You look at South America, it's like some of the numbers are just horrific. It's dangerous stuff, whether it's here or someplace else. No country is immune.
That may be true, but we were with a lot of European colleagues at this dinner last night. I was sitting with the Canadians. There was a German embassy representative nearby. This is the thing they talk about when they talk about America. Mm-hmm. Is this becoming the thing people think about when they look at the United States? And how does that impact how people interact with our leaders and with us as a country?
These are great questions. I tend to think that people were already thinking of America in that way, and I'm not sure what happened last night changes any of that. I also think people have incredibly short memories. And a couple of weeks from now, when we're talking about whether to have this dinner again, this might feel like a long time ago. Butler went away very quickly in the minds of a lot of Americans. So I guess we'll have to see with all of that. But I do believe in the essence, the spirit of this dinner. I think there's actually something really wonderful to be said about these groups of people getting together who have a typically pretty antagonistic relationship. There weren't all that many celebrities there really last night. It was largely a journalistic and policymaker get together. And of course, yeah, there are always going to be celebrities there. But striking to see in 2026 how quickly people have the playbook in their head of what to do when they hear a sound like that or see people running. I had an ambassador at my table who was under the table within seconds. People dove to the floor long before they had any idea of what was happening. And that's kind of sad to think about this morning.
I want to pick up on that quickly because, yes, they did that and they did it impulsively. There was, and there'll be critiques of how all of this unfolded, I'm sure. There was a real gap of information for a very long time. And I think that's something that was very striking to me as I made my way out of there eventually and made my way back to the hotel. Yes, we're sadly inured to a lot of this. But in that moment, I personally expected more guidance on do you stay or do you go?
Someone
or how are you
came to the podium
yourself?
within, maybe 20 or 30 minutes and said, we're trying to get it together. Hang on, we're going to resume the program, which they did not do. I've got to think, too, and I don't know if Jeff has a thought on this, that the President of the United States wanted to come back out, pump the fist, fight, do the routine. And I'm assuming the Secret Service didn't think that was viable.
Yeah, I know that from sources that he wanted to stay. And that's one reason why those mixed messages were coming, because the president said he wanted to come out and give that speech. So that was a competing thing last night. I'd like to talk about gun violence in a second, but I think we're running out of time.
We'll come back, but I think, as you say, he blamed it on protocol, the fact that he couldn't do that last night. Following those protocols, he couldn't go back and finish what was underway. I want to recap that breaking news I mentioned just moments ago. The acting Attorney General, Todd Blanche, confirming the suspected shooter traveled from California to D.C. to target Trump administration officials. We're going to have more on the charges that he's facing here in Washington, what the charges beyond that might be. That's straight ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend, on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg.com, on the Bloomberg Business app.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. A man armed with guns and knives stormed the lobby outside of the White House Correspondents Association dinner last night, forcing President Donald Trump to be rushed from the stage and guests ducking under tables. Now, police say Cole Thomas Allen was a guest at the Washington Hilton where the dinner was being held. He was taken into custody and is expected in court on Monday. Now, they believe he opened fire and acted alone, but did not say who was his intended target or describe a motive. But on NBC's Meet the Press, Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche said the gunman is believed to have been targeting members of the Trump administration. Now, at a press conference, President Donald Trump thanked the press, officials, and also the Secret Service.
A man charged a security checkpoint armed with multiple weapons, and he was taken down by some very brave members of Secret Service, and they acted very quickly.
The president said he wants to hold that event again within the next 30 days. Well, in other news, U.S.-Iran peace talks have stalled as the conflict approaches the 2-month mark. President Donald Trump canceled a planned trip by his top envoys, and the Islamic Republic said it won't negotiate so long as it's being threatened. But both countries, they are maintaining a blockade on the Strait of Hormuz. Now, meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he ordered his country's military to strike Hezbollah targets in Lebanon on Saturday without giving details. The Israel Defense Forces later said it carried out strikes on weapons storage sites in southern Lebanon. Earlier, it said 2 projectiles were launched from Lebanon toward Israel. Christina and David.
Thank you very much for that update. We're going to put up some live pictures now outside the suspect's home in Torrance, California. That's in Los Angeles County. A short time ago, the acting Attorney General, Todd Blanche, said Cole Allen traveled via train to Washington via Chicago to that dinner last night.
Obviously, still early there on the West Coast. You can see the sun just coming up. Joining us now with more on the criminal investigation into Roy Taylor. Roy Taylor, who spent his career in law enforcement at the federal, state, and local levels. And Elliot Williams is back with us. He's CNN legal analyst, former federal prosecutor, and author of a new book, 5 Bullets. Roy, I want to start with you. We've been talking a lot about how this investigation is going to proceed. And one of the things that's always complicated in Washington is you have so many different agencies, and it's a bit of a jurisdictional soup. Who is going to take the lead? How does this work out? And how many people are going to have a hand in figuring out what went down here?
Most likely the Secret Service will be the lead investigative agency and supported by the FBI with all of their resources because the protection of the president falls under the Secret Service. So most likely the charges will come from them.
What are investigators looking for at this point in time? We talked a bit about this in the last hour. Searches, I imagine, continuing at the Hilton here in Washington, D.C., now at that home in Torrance, California. What does that investigative process look like, do you think?
Well, they're doing the background investigation. They already know that he acted as a tutor for a company called C2 in California. I mean, they've basically already dissected this guy's life. They know all about him, no criminal history that we're made aware of. They're going to look for where he purchased the firearms, the knives, where he got on the train, how he had disassembled the weapon to reassemble it once he got onto the site, when he made the reservations to stay in that hotel. They'll have a complete timeline and background on this individual within the next 48 hours.
Elliot, we've been talking a lot about what they're going to do, how they're going to charge him, and how they're going to press it. Does the fact that he had lower caliber weapons, he wasn't there with an automatic weapon, he could have done a lot of damage. Does that factor into intent? Does that factor into these charges at all? And does it matter when you're looking at how they proceed with this?
No, as long as it is a firearm, for the most part, merely an operable firearm is enough.
It's the same charge.
Yeah, it's the same charge. Now, if it's a machine gun, and that term, then there are separate charges for carrying, brandishing, displaying, or firing a machine gun. A modified firearm, if there are things that he put on it to make it operate differently, there are charges for that, and sentencing enhancements for that as well, and then any other devices that he might have had. So certainly one merely needs to have a firearm, at least for the things that he's said to be charged with tomorrow, but all the proof is in the type of weapon that he had.
And how important is it in this case whether he purchased those guns legally or not legally?
It's not. Again, that's when you start getting, it's a couple things. One, if it's an unlawfully purchased firearm, he could be charged with that purchase. Okay. And again, there's a difference between convicting someone of a crime and sentencing them for it. All of these things can come in at sentencing. It's much more of a free-for-all to bump someone's sentence up if you find that he stole the firearm, illegally manipulated the serial number on it or whatever else. All of those things might factor in.
I want to ask you about the moment that we are in right now, focusing in specific on the security camera footage that we saw thanks to the president who posted it online. I'm curious, first of all, what you take away from seeing that, him charging through that magnometer area into the ballroom before he stopped. But more than that, sort of this moment at which the president can put something like that out on social media. Obviously, he opined on this suspect last night behind the podium at the White House. Suffice to say, this colors the investigation and potential prosecution of an individual when the president does. This is not the first time that he's done that as well.
Right. I cringe and cringed whenever anyone who is not the FBI or the Secret Service releases anything that could be evidence, right? Because, number one, at the time it was released, perhaps it had been vetted, perhaps it had been cleared by law enforcement, but it's potentially evidence in an active and open criminal investigation.
It was so early. I mean, we've all covered these cases, and usually you're waiting and waiting and waiting for some form of video. It's days, sometimes weeks before you get something like that.
And I want to be clear, whatever we saw there is horrible. It was potentially unsafe to the president, many members of the cabinet, and many members of the public. However, as of right now, no one is charged with a crime. There's any, I think we all have a great sense as to who the person who's charged with the crime will be, but it's incredibly risky to start putting out images or surveillance footage before any charges have come down, and even after, because then you're talking about how do you affect the jury pool. If you want this guy to get convicted, you want the investigation to be as clean as possible, and that also means releasing as little information to the public as possible before he goes to trial.
Roy,
sorry, go ahead. You go ahead.
That's okay. Roy, when you look at that video, and David can jump in with his question as well, I'm wondering what you see as someone with a lot of experience at different levels of law enforcement, if you see any tactical errors, if you see any holes in that checkpoint, because it seems like he was able to penetrate that initial line fairly quickly. Now, they did get him to the ground, but why was he able to get through that in the first place?
He surprised the officer that was on the post there that we see in the video that was released. The officer happened to be looking the other way. He most likely heard the running footsteps. He turned, he saw the person run past him, and then immediately drew his firearm. And I give him credit. He didn't leave his post. He stuck with his post. Other officers responded and gave chase to the individual, which was all off camera. But that just shows the importance of having different levels of security, different perimeters of security, so that these people can be stopped at the farthest most point from the protectees. Even though we got past them, the dinner was sealed off. There was no way for him to get inside that room. So he would have been stopped before he could even get in sight with the president.
Roy, I wonder if you could talk about the way that law enforcement cooperates and collaborates on events like these. And those of us who have lived in Washington know how many different police departments are in this jurisdiction, how many different branches of law enforcement there are here. How complicated, how difficult is it a task for all those different agencies to work together as seamlessly as possible on a big marquee event like the one that took place here in Washington last night?
It's difficult. I planned one big event when I was in that area for General Clapper when he retired from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and the entire the president, the cabinet, everyone, all the top military leaders were supposed to attend, and we started that planning a year out, and we had monthly meetings so that we could, coordinate and liaise with each other, establish communications, points of contact, specific duties. But it is a long process, and it starts early. And like I said, mine was a year out with monthly interaction with the involved agencies.
Elliot, I saw you scribbling over there. I was wondering if there's anything you want to comment on. Otherwise, I'm going to play you some sound.
Oh, no, let's hear the sound. The scribbling is how I stay following. Everybody has their tactics and techniques for being up. No, I'm agreeing with everything he's saying, and quite frankly, to the point, something like 24 law enforcement entities in Washington, D.C. I've worked with the U.S. Attorney's Office and ICE and the Justice Department, and quite frankly, often they are at odds over who gets to handle the case, who gets to proceed with it. And so, yes, I know they're doing their best, but there's long history between all these agencies. Yeah.
Also, it's not supposed to be political, but we know that this is Washington. And I'm wondering, when it comes to, I know it's early yet, but when it comes to potential charges he's facing, whether it's federal, whether it's local, if there could be pressure or influence from the White House to elevate those charges or to charge him in a way that, how amenable or subjected how does that happen?
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is a very important question to ask in this moment. And I will note that this is other people's reporting. Juries in Washington, D.C. have lost a fair amount of faith in the Justice Department over the last several years. As you see, they have one of the lowest conviction rates of offices around the country. Cases are getting thrown out by grand juries and regular juries.
Right, they refused to indict the guy who threw the sandwich at
all of those things, and that's a function of the public statements from the president and the Justice Department to some extent. That can taint this prosecution as well. It will have to be prosecuted in Washington, D.C. in all likelihood. This is where it happened. This is where any number of the events around it would have happened. I think it's hard to make the case to charge it in California. So these years of trouble around the Justice Department might not imperil this case, but certainly it's in the jury's mind.
I want to go to your book, which is about an incident that took place many decades ago, but I want to kind of bring up the crucible in which you wrote that book. And it was one of political violence, the killing of Jordan Neely on the subway in New York City. And in the book, you write about how that's very much informing the way that you were looking at that incident. If you could talk just a bit about that. Right. We were talking about how we're kind of inured to the way that mass shootings unfold. If we haven't experienced them ourselves, we've seen the way in which people have. How have you thought about that as you explored this incident again that took place many years ago?
Right. Certainly, the shooting where Bernard Goetz shot 4 black teenagers on the New York City subway came at a moment of profound violence and roughness in New York. The crime rate, the homicide rate was 1,700 a year, which is far more than anything we see today. I think the bigger moment about all, political or high-profile violence is how quick the rush to judgment is from the public. And I know Bernard Goetz got made into a hero right away because of the news media to some extent, people around him. Today, anyone who commits a serious violent act, particularly a political one, you can expect that the internet is probably celebrating this individual. Anyone who has a cell phone or open social media knows that there are probably people cheering an assault attempt or an assassination attempt on the president of the United States because our news climate, or certainly our social media climate, rewards that. And throughout time, people's willingness to celebrate violent acts is something that is as American as political violence. That's the thing we need to tamp down. I do talk about this quite a bit in the book, 5 Bullets, that when these acts happen, the tragedy that follows the tragedy is often how quick people are to celebrate these acts. And we ought to be able to just put it aside judge and adjudicate everything fairly, but recognize that it does not help to go out on social media clapping and celebrating when many people could have been seriously hurt or killed.
Or even how quick to forget, which is something that Joe was talking about. And I remember when I covered, we just have a little bit of time, but, you know, the memory of these things tends to fade. And is that one of the reasons you wanted to address this specific case?
Absolutely. And we write books for the future, not today. And I remember the Bernard Goetz shooting vividly from growing up in New Jersey. 9/11, my God, people have forgotten that to some extent already.
That's insane to me. I know. All right. Thank you so much for being on set with us. Roy Taylor, we also appreciate you joining us early this morning. Thank you both for being with us.
Coming up, a big week here for the Fed. Jerome Powell's final press conference as chair and a vote on Kevin Warsh's confirmation scheduled for Wednesday of this week. Our colleague Michael McCaul is going to join us next on Bloomberg This Weekend, live from Washington, D.C.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. Investigators continue to search for a motive in a shooting at the White House Correspondents Association dinner last night. President Trump was set to speak at the annual event to celebrate press freedoms when gunfire erupted outside of the ballroom of the Washington Hilton. Now, a California man is in custody and is expected to be arraigned on Monday. Police said identified him as 31-year-old Cole Thomas Allen. President Trump said no country is immune from political violence.
I was talking to somebody from another country today, and they have numerous assassinations of political figures all over the world. You look at South America, it's like some of the numbers are just horrific. It's dangerous stuff, whether it's here or someplace else. No country is immune.
The president said he wants the event rescheduled within 30 days. Now, in other news, a ceasefire is in jeopardy after President Trump canceled a planned trip to Pakistan by his top envoys for negotiations over the Iran conflict. And Iran's top diplomat met mediators in Pakistan and left Islamabad well ahead of the planned arrival of U.S. envoys. Despite Iran tensions, King Charles III will follow his mother's lead in celebrating U.S. and U.K. relations. King Charles and Queen Camilla will begin their 4-day trip tomorrow, and they will have tea with President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump. The formal arrival ceremony that will take place on Tuesday. Christina and David.
I bet this will come up as a topic of conversation when he sits down with the president. Thank you, Lisa, very much. This will likely be an historic week for the Federal Reserve, not just because of a pending decision on interest rates, but for the man who leads the century-old organization.
With us now is Michael McCaul, Bloomberg's international economics and policy correspondent who covers the Fed for us, no doubt booking his trip here to Washington, D.C. for Wednesday of next week when the Senate Banking Committee is going to have a vote, we have learned, on Kevin Warsh, the president's pick to be the next chair of the Federal Reserve. Mike, what can we expect? It's the start of the new week here. What is that hearing going to be like? I guess we're waiting with bated breath here to see what one member of that committee is going to say.
Well, the vote on the meeting of the Banking Committee to hold a vote may not be open. They don't always do it in open session, but it'll be short. They'll already have the votes counted, basically, and they'll come out and make a move to accept him, and then it goes to the floor of the Senate. It's a little bit tough these days with the Senate because they got so many other pending legislative issues, but one feels that John Thune will find a way to get it to the floor before May 15th so Kevin Warsh can be sworn in. We have to assume, we haven't heard yet from Tom Tillis, but we have to assume that they would not have scheduled the vote unless he had agreed to vote in favor of the nominee.
There's a lot happening around this meeting, but we're not exactly expecting anything to happen, right? We're not expecting any significant changes on rate cuts. It's mostly about the things we've been talking about Powell and all this surrounding this meeting itself.
It's really going to be about Jay Powell. It's technically his last meeting as Fed chair. If Kevin Warsh is confirmed right away, then he will take over on May 16th. But there isn't going to be any move in interest rates. There's not a new set of economic projections. There's not a new dot plot. So a lot of this is going to be focused on what Jay Powell's future plans are. There is a headline out this morning that Todd Blanche was on one of the other morning shows, the acting attorney general, and he said, if the probe uncovers anything, the probe by the inspector general, then we are going to investigate. And that's exactly what Jay Powell said he doesn't want. He said that until this is really and finally closed, he's not leaving the Fed. So even if Warsh takes over as chair, Powell may still be on the Fed as a governor. He can stay till 2028. So a lot of the questioning, I'm sure, will focus on that.
Yeah, you've taken me right where I want to go. And that is what Powell has said in the past, that he won't be satisfied until the investigation is completed with transparency and finality. We haven't heard from Tom Tillis, the senator from North Carolina. We haven't heard from Jay Powell either. Do we have any sense of what he meant by that? If this investigation by the DOJ has been dropped, as Janine Pirro says it has been, and it's kicked over to the Inspector General of the Federal Reserve, do you think that's enough to satisfy the Fed chair? Has he indicated as much?
He has not indicated. I've been told that the Fed is not particularly happy with what they have heard, but it's going to be Powell's decision. He wanted the case closed with prejudice, meaning you can't file anything new. Now, the Inspector General has been working on this for a year, almost since July of last year when Powell asked him to investigate. So it shouldn't take very long for the IG to get a report out. And the Banking Committee has asked for a hearing within 90 days. It may not even take that long. And if the IG clears Powell, then maybe he will resign. But if not, or if it's indeterminate, then Powell probably stays on. Now, I would guess that Powell is going to stay on until at least we see the Inspector General's report, because he's still in some legal jeopardy if the IG finds that there was something wrong.
Michael McKee, I'm going to go out on a limb here and bet that you watched our interview yesterday with Dan Yergin. We talked to him, the great energy expert, about the Fed's capacity to see through what's been going on in the Middle East. And he expressed some real hesitation that they'll be able to do that. So even if, as Christina points out, there's not going to be any sort of cuts or increases at this meeting this week, I suspect that the dialogue around that table is going to be fascinating. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about that, the way that Fed policymakers in their speeches and interviews leading up to this meeting have addressed all of the uncertainty that is part of the war, that this war has wrought as they kind of see their way through this, the economy.
Well, there are kind of two aspects, because there are two mandates. Before the war, even, there were concerns about the labor market. The Fed's been more worried since the war started about inflation. So they'll be talking about both and what they think is going to happen in each. The feeling is that the labor market is stable, but not all that healthy, while inflation may be a real danger. They want to look through the energy prices because those are temporary, and at some point they'll start to come back down, but they won't go as low as they were for some time. And the stories that you read about the second round effects, Bloomberg had a great one yesterday. I encourage everybody to read that. There's a feeling that, like an offshore tsunami, this is going to start hitting all kinds of companies in the U.S. and around the world, because supplies have not been delivered and because companies can't operate without enough fuel. And so prices are going to continue to go up, not just for energy. We noted that China has already started raising prices on exports that are not energy related, and we import a lot from China. So we could continue to see inflation rise for some months, and that creates a real dilemma for the Fed. Do they threaten the labor market by raising rates to head off inflation, or do they stimulate the economy and risk further inflation by cutting rates? So this is not going to be a story that goes away soon for the Fed and whoever is the chair.
But I want to ask you about that, because one of the criticisms of Powell's tenure and the Fed under his command was that they were slow to respond initially to inflationary trends. And if we're seeing these second stream effects from the war, and we see all the things you just talked about starting to kick in, if you have this uncertainty lingering at the top of the Fed, does that impact their ability to be nimble and to respond where they need to these economic trends?
Probably not, because Kevin Warsh is really going to be the only change, and we sort of know where Stephen Myron comes down all the time. So the rest of the Open Market Committee has been dealing with shocks like this for now years, and they've had a lot of chance to talk through what's going on with the war and its effect on prices and scenarios for what might happen. I think they'd be able to react appropriately. The question is, what's the best reaction? And that's hard to know. It's interesting that Kevin Warsh is coming into the Fed critical of the Fed's performance with the inflation breakout in 2021. And he said he wants to change the Fed's inflation framework. So it will be interesting to see whether he can and by how much in a short period of time to try to head off any criticism that the Fed might be slow or react wrongly this time.
Our international economics and policy correspondent Michael McCaul joining us here on this Sunday morning. That interview with Tom Tillis is scheduled to take place here in a few minutes' time. We'll be monitoring that, of course, bring you any headlines from what the North Carolina senator has to say about his position on Kevin Warsh's nomination now that those charges, or that investigation, rather, into Jerome Powell has been passed from the Justice Department on to the IG at the Federal Reserve. And I should note that Mike McCaul is going to have special coverage for us on Wednesday, a special edition of Surveillance the Fed Decides, starting at 1:30 p.m. on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television.
All right, last night's shooting at the Washington Hilton reminded many of the attempted assassination of President Reagan at that exact same hotel. A look back at that time in 1981 with presidential historian Douglas Brinkley to help talk to us about the trends we're seeing and all the historical moments that echoed what we saw this week. Stick with us. Bloomberg This Weekend. We'll be right back.
We've been reporting on the shooting at the White House Correspondents Association dinner last night here in Washington, D.C., shortly after President Trump addressed the press, opening up about being a potential target for would-be assassins. Here we had to say.
I've studied assassinations, and I must tell you, the most impactful people, the people that do the most, you take a look at the people, Abraham Lincoln, I mean, you go through the people that have gone through this where they got them, but the people that do the most, the people that make the biggest impact, they're the ones that they go after. They don't go after the ones that don't do much because they like it that way. And when you look at the people that have either, whether it was an attempt or a successful attempt, they're very impactful people. Just take a look at the names here, the big names. And I hate to say I'm honored by that, but I've done a lot. We've done a lot.
Joining us now is not Doug Brinkley. It is our internal historian, Joe Matthew. Joe, have you studied assassinations, as the president says he has? I mean, but seriously, like, talk to us about the history of that building, of what has happened there previously, and of other attacks on presidents, and how that's kind of changed Washington, the apparatus around the president, including the TV pool.
Yeah, well, we were speaking earlier, you know, in the wake of Butler, the sort of muscle memory that so many people have, not just the press corps, but there were a lot of folks in the room, officials, people who were just invited guests, and everybody seemed to move on cue. Before they knew what was going on, in many cases, they were on the floor, they were under tables. There was a picture that I saw on the front of our website and on the terminal last evening of our booker, Matt Shirley, who jumped on top of one of his colleagues. And that's the spirit of what took place in that room, and the people who had a shared experience is really sad to think about, that that's an automatic. But yes, I wonder if that dinner will ever be held again in what is known affectionately here in Washington as the Hinckley Hilton, because that is where the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan took place. When you walked into that entrance and went on the red carpet, Christina, you walked right by where that took place. There's a plaque commemorating that awful day. And so we do have a shared history here in Washington of these tragedies. The way the president went after that with the rhetoric last evening, to take this as some sort of compliment, is bizarre, but that in a way is very Donald Trump.
That awful day, March 30th, 1981, the president was there to speak to the AFL-CIO, if I'm not mistaken, and he kept a journal. I remember him writing, it's a pithy quote, "Getting shot hurts," is what he wrote. But speak to the confusion that surrounded all of that. Of course, one of his closest advisors was injured grievously in that attack.
That's right.
The president, as I recall, didn't know that he had been shot until he was in the limousine, noticed he was bleeding, and thought perhaps he'd cut himself, or that, of course, was much worse than that, and he ended up in the hospital for a couple of days.
And as you both know, we still call it the Brady briefing room for that reason at the White House. I'll tell you guys, we saw J.D. Vance taken out of the room immediately, and I was struck by the fact that there weren't 5 or 10 Secret Service members jumping on top of the president behind the dais. He was still talking, sitting next to Wee Jiang for a good 30 seconds to a minute while all of this chaos was unfolding, and then they came and got the president. I don't know if there'll be an exercise in which all of this is reviewed. I'm sure there will be. But it was a different look than what we saw in Butler. The president was kind of calmly taken off the stage, and I'm sure was brought into a holding room immediately. We didn't see him again until he was back at the White House at that point. But the enduring vision I will have is of these SWAT team dressed law enforcement officers
I think we have some video that
dais.
I actually shot from my phone that we can roll.
They're pointing their weapons into the crowd, and they had lights on the scopes. And when we saw the guns pointed at us, we knew that this was not a normal moment.
As everybody was down, the journalist instinct rolls hard, and a couple of us were up a little higher than we probably should have been filming. And Joe, to your point, I do remember I saw the scope on the stage, one of the, the TAC guys turn, and my fear was, in a crowd, whether this would reflect and catch their eye, and I didn't want them to think it was something else, so I lowered it. I do want to go back to talking about Jim Brady a little bit, because to your point, in the White House, that is the Brady briefing room. Yeah. And even though this alleged assailant did not, as far as we know, have an assault weapon, something that came out of that attack on President Reagan was the Brady bill. And talk to us about what that did and why it no longer applies.
Well, that's interesting. And I'm surprised that there was not any conversation in the briefing with the president last evening about a potential congressional response. I know you'll probably talk to the chairman about this coming up. That's usually the first leg in the story. What are we going to do about this? How did he get the guns? And will there be a Second Amendment response? Will there be a legislative response? I wouldn't expect that now. You can't even talk about bump stocks on Capitol Hill these days, never mind a more considered effort to control access to guns. So I don't think we're going to be doing that this time.
You mentioned his comments that he made last night. There was a bizarre aspect to it, but it is something that kind of animated him throughout his reelection campaign. That was a seismic moment, what happened in Butler, and it is something that clearly, as we heard from him last night, is something he's engaged with a lot. He's thought about that moment, as one would, I assume, and it is something that I think he invokes from time to time, that it gives him some sort of... His surviving that attack has really animated his political career.
He's talked about divine intervention, that the hand of God reached down that day in Butler. He certainly talked about that at the convention while he had the gauze on his ear. But he seems to think that this is an acknowledgement that he's doing the right thing, that if you're a disruptor, if you're a change agent, as he wants to be, that these kinds of things happen. And it's up to the Secret Service to keep him safe.
Joe Matthew, thank you very much. Joe Matthew, the co-anchor of Bloomberg's Balance of Power, who was with us at that dinner last night. We'll continue to follow all of the news coming out of the investigation into that suspect and what happened there. Of course, the latest news from Todd Blanche, the acting attorney general. That suspect came from California to Washington, D.C., and Mr. Blanche suggested the motivation there was to attack the president's administration.
And as Joe mentioned, we've got some big guests coming up. We're coming up on the 9 a.m. hour here in Washington. Next will be Republican Congressman Mike McCaul, who was also at last night's dinner, and we're going to ask him what Congress is going to do, as well as Congressman Don Beyer of Virginia. We start right now. Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. We are coming to you live from Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura with Lisa Mateo. It is Sunday, April the 26th, and we are following the breaking news from last night on the shooting at the White House Correspondents Association dinner in Washington, D.C. This just in from Bloomberg's Miles Miller, who covers the Department of Homeland Security for us. The man accused of storming the White House Correspondents' dinner spent years quietly acquiring his arsenal, purchasing a shotgun from a Torrance, California firearms dealer 8 months before this attack, and a semi-automatic pistol 2 years earlier. That's according to a law enforcement intelligence profile that has been reviewed by Bloomberg News.
All right, we're going to go to Lisa now for the updates.
Let's get more to those nuts and bolts of the story, and let's get to that suspect. He is in custody. That's after shots were fired at the White House Correspondents' dinner in Washington last night. Now, police say 31-year-old Cole Thomas Allen, he was armed with a shotgun, a handgun, multiple knives, and charged through a security checkpoint. President Donald Trump was rushed off stage. Now, FBI agents, they assembled overnight outside a home linked to the suspect in Torrance, California. On NBC's Meet the Press, Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche said the gunman is believed to have been targeting members of the Trump administration. Now, despite the chaos, President Trump says the event will be held again.
Again, within the next 30 days, it will make it bigger and better and even nicer.
Well, that suspect was taken into custody, is expected to be in court on Monday. Now to other news. U.S.-Iran peace talks, they have stalled as the conflict approaches the 2-month mark. President Donald Trump canceled a planned trip by his top envoys, and the Islamic Republic said it won't negotiate so long as it's being threatened. The U.S. has been trying to increase pressure with Iran with a continued naval blockade. President Trump, he ordered the U.S. Navy to shoot any boat putting mines in the Strait of Hormuz and said the Navy is clearing out Iranian mines from the waterway. Now, experts say sweeping for underwater explosives, that could take months. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he ordered his country's military to strike Hezbollah targets in Lebanon on Saturday. The Israel Defense Forces said it carried out strikes on weapons storage sites in southern Lebanon. In other news, also, King Charles III and Queen Camilla will begin their 4-day trip to the U.S. tomorrow, when they will have tea with President Trump, First Lady Melania Trump. The formal arrival ceremony will take place on Tuesday. And also this week, Elon Musk's case against Sam Altman and OpenAI and its backer Microsoft heads to trial. Jury selection is set for tomorrow. Now, Musk's lawsuit against OpenAI, the company they founded together more than a decade ago, is looking to unwind the company's for-profit conversion and could cost OpenAI big money, as well as trigger an overhaul of that ChatGPT maker. Christina and David, over to you.
Lisa, thank you very much. Getting a tweet here from the president, a post on Truth Social from the president of the United States talking about the prospects of there being a new ballroom at the White House that we've been discussing over the course of the morning. The president brought that up in his comments to the press last night, saying what happened last night at the Hilton here in Washington, D.C. is further evidence of the fact there needs to be a space of size at the White House where an event like this could be held. We've talked with Jeff Mason a bit about the complication factors around all of that. That wouldn't be a public venue, of course, but the president here taking issue with the lawsuit that's been filed against the construction of that ballroom. You see there a very lengthy post. I'm not going to read all of it, but taking that litigant to task, suggesting again that this is something that needs to happen and would have perhaps prevented what we saw last night, Christina.
Yeah, and Jeff Mason, in that big block of text, the part that stands out to me is right at the top, and the president says, this is what happened last night is the exact reason our great military, Secret Service, law enforcement, and every president for the last 150 years have been demanding that a large, safe, and secure ballroom be built on the grounds of the White House. Is that accurate? And why is this the thing the president is focused on this morning?
No, it's not accurate. And it seems almost uncomfortable to have to be fact-checking the president on something that is not as important as what happened last night. But he is following a political adage, which is never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think that's exemplified in what he said last night and in this particular post. The president's ballroom is going through a whole bunch of legal threats. That's really gotten under his skin. He wants to have it built before he leaves office at the end of his second term. There are question marks about that, even as there's a big pile of nothingness where the East Wing used to stand. And he is emphasizing that if this event had been there, if that existed, then there would be more security. But you're right to mention, which I did earlier as well, that was the ballroom at the White House is not going to be a public ballroom for outside organizations to use. And the White House Correspondents Association is an organization of journalists, that does not work for the White House. You
can't book it like a wedding venue.
Correct.
Yeah.
Some 12 hours after this incident took place, we're getting more information on what transpired, more information about the suspect, Jeff. And across television this morning, we're hearing from policymakers and politicians who were in attendance at this dinner. We're going to hear from a couple here in just a moment. But Todd Blanche, the acting attorney general, was on Meet the Press this morning talking about that investigation. What did he learn? How does that advance the story as we know it of who this individual is and indeed what the focus of this law enforcement investigation is going to be going forward?
Just getting a few more details, but not a lot. It's a 31-year-old, apparently, teacher from California who traveled to Washington, D.C. By train. To the extent that that's interesting, we know that he had apparently a shotgun, another gun, and multiple knives. He stayed at the hotel at the Washington Hilton, which we were referring to earlier as the Hinckley Hilton, and that is how he had those weapons, but still raising a lot of security questions about how he made it down at least 2 escalators to get very close to the ballroom before he was taken down.
All right, Jeff Mason, thank you so much. And joining us now is Republican Congressman Michael McCaul of Texas. He serves on the Foreign Affairs and Homeland Security Committees. He was also our guest at the White House Correspondents Dinner last night. Chairman, first of all, how are you? And the first thing I want to ask you is, we spent a lot of time standing in that well after this all happened last night. When you went about the dinner last night, do you think there was enough security there? You've been there before. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, let's put my chairman of Homeland Security hat on. I was a former counterterrorism federal prosecutor. I would say the Secret Service did an amazing job. Capitol Police escorted the members out in emergency vehicles. But the outer perimeter, if you will, was very free access. It's an open hotel. And I think that was part of the risk, involved here if you had to analyze it. It's very difficult to harden that kind of environment. But when you have the president coming in, what I was sort of amazed is you had the president and the vice president at the head table and the speaker. So you had the line of succession right there. If a bomb had gone off or something more dramatic, it would fall to Chuck Grassley. Amazingly.
After this took place, you thanked Secret Service and the Capitol Police for squiring you and your congressional colleagues out of the room. Something Joe Matthew brought up a few minutes ago is what it was like to see those security officials on stage, yes, with weapons, but then how Secret Service, those law enforcement knew exactly where everybody was. There was an eerie quiet in this space. But talk a bit about that, what you were thinking as you watched all of that unfold, because I confess, from where I was sitting, we were beginning to eat. There was some commotion, and then it became very, very quiet in the room.
Well, I heard 3 gunshots, so I knew something was horribly wrong. And you're not quite sure what's going to happen after that, right? And I saw the president being taken off the stage, Secret Service jumping up on the stage with their weapons pointed towards the audience. And it was surreal, it's not an ordinary event. Unfortunately, it's becoming too commonplace in this country, but they went into action very quickly and escorted the cabinet members out of the room. But you don't know what's going to happen quite after that. I didn't know if we're going to have like an AR-15 and a spray of bullets, and are we going to be diving under the tables? And fortunately, we heard the 3 gunshots, and that was the end of it. This country's getting too violent, and the rhetoric needs to tone down, in my opinion. I was at Texas A&M talking about civility and politics just this last week with Henry Cuellar, a Democrat, talking about, how we can agree to disagree, but with civility. And I think last night's a good lesson for all of us. And, amazingly, the press, right? We were celebrating the First Amendment and the freedom of the press. And the press were there along with Republicans and Democrats all together celebrating our Constitution. And the First Amendment does not allow for political violence.
We were talking about the First Amendment, but it often comes into contradiction, it seems, with the Second Amendment, especially when your party votes on issues. They've been very reticent more and more. We were talking about Jim Brady and the Brady bill. That was the Reagan administration. Mm-hmm. This is a current Republican climate in which almost any gun control, even logical gun control, is impossible to get passed. Is that something your party should reevaluate, given what you just talked about, the heated political rhetoric and the violence that we're seeing?
It's interesting. As I was talking to your CEO right next to me about this very issue before the shooting, and when I met with Michael Bloomberg and he donated my campaign, this is many years ago, he said, "You're from Texas, and where are you on guns, right?" Yeah. And we were having this conversation that, of course, the weapons purchased, I think he had it wasn't like an AR-15. It wasn't. I used to prosecute gun cases. A lot of them were stolen, but there has to be a way to. Usually, after the fact, flags come up. Like, I knew this guy, and I thought there was a problem, but they don't report it until after. And I had to build like a fusion center to capture the red flags and then be able to act beforehand, or at least provide more security if there's a threat out there. So I think there is room for improvement here. I don't think you're going to see my party, infringing on the Second Amendment per se. But there are certain weapons under the 1968 Gun Control Act, like fully automatic machine guns that are, and that was an outgrowth of, Robert Kennedy. Of course, you had JFK assassinated in the 60s, Robert Kennedy, and then you had Martin Luther King. And we had that legislation in 1968. That's the last time we've done that.
Chairman Emeritus mentioned Michael Bloomberg, of course, the majority shareholder of Bloomberg LP, the parent company of Bloomberg News. Want to get that out there.
Disclaimer there.
I want to ask you about what Homeland Security is going to do next year, the Committee on Homeland Security. Will there be an investigation, do you think? What questions do you have about the way in which all of this unfolded? I think a lot of us took note of the way that security was set up. You rightly bring up the fact this was an open hotel. There were guests there totally unaffiliated with this dinner. What do you want to see investigated in terms of what that perimeter was like, how fortified it was?
I think we have to. We have to take a look at the outer perimeter. Now, as I understand, he was a guest at the hotel. So anytime you have a big event like that, and it's known as the Hinckley Hotel because in 1981 Reagan was shot there, so it has a bit of a checkered past, and so I do think we'll be analyzing that. I think also it just reemphasizes how important it is to fully fund the Department of Homeland Security and stop this nonsense of a shutdown of a very important agency within our federal government.
Still partially shut down.
It is.
What is your take on the appropriateness of the president's Truth Social post that we just saw this morning and everything we've talked about, violence, political rhetoric, that the president is focusing on building a ballroom? What's your take on that?
Well, let me say first, I think his remarks last night were very gracious towards the press, and to both Democrats and Republican alike. I'm glad he took the high road in the rhetoric, which I think needs to be addressed. The ballroom, I was in the East Wing and he pointed to it. It's a big hole in the ground. It's going to have a lot of security features to it in the basement. But I think, as was pointed out earlier, this is a private association. It's not, that's a federal building, essentially. So I don't know. I mean, I think it would certainly be a lot more secure if it was done at a place like that. The next time the president shows up, I think they're going to tighten up security even more so on the outer perimeter. And again, the line of secession all being there at the same time, I think we ought to take a look at that as well.
Is that concerning? Is that something Congress should investigate?
Yeah, of course. I was really shocked that the president and vice president were at the table together.
Surprise.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the rhetoric, and I'm curious how hotter rhetoric has shaped the way that you approach your job. Is it something that you give more thought to? God forbid something like this were to happen. How has it shaped the way that you and your colleagues in Congress approach the job? We've seen some reticence to attend town hall meetings if they get pretty fractious.
Yeah.
Who knows what might happen? What are the consequences on a day-to-day basis for having the kind of heated rhetoric that we have in this country today?
Well, we're a reflection of the American people, and there is a violent rhetoric out there. But we don't have to be an echo chamber for that. And the irony was I was just at this symposium at a university in my district where we talked about this very issue and how it needs to be. I've been up there 22 years up here, and it's changed for the worse. And it's okay to go on social media and say vile things about the other party and other members of Congress and the president.
But isn't some of that coming from the top down? Isn't the president partly to blame for that?
Well, I think we're probably all to blame. And you know what happens when these things occur? Everybody says the right things for a couple of days, and then I'll give this a couple of weeks, and we're going to be right back at this violent rhetoric out there, and it doesn't seem to change. You can't legislate that. That is a conduct issue. It's a moral clarity issue, and I think the institution is weakened and hurt by, and politics in general are hurt by this violent rhetoric that is out there today. And I hope members do reflect on this. The ones that want their 5 minutes of fame on YouTube and social media, I hope they reflect. It's not how I conduct myself. I wasn't raised that way. It's not my value system. I show respect for people that have other opinions. And that's what democracy is all about. That's what the press, the First Amendment, freedom of speech and press is all about. And we got to respect each other a little bit more. Last night, I've been in war zones in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I've, heard mortar shells and,
Ukraine,
rounds of ammunition. I'm going to Ukraine and this summer and, drones and all that kind of stuff. But you don't expect that, at the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C.
Do you have confidence in who's going to be leading this investigation prosecution? So Kash Patel, not somebody who has a traditional background for somebody running the FBI. Mark Wayne Mullen just taking this job over as DHS secretary. Should we be at all worried about those individuals' capacity to see this through?
Well, they're the figurehead. I do think, like when I was a federal prosecutor, the line FBI agents, line Secret Service, they've been doing this for many years. They're professional, and they know how to conduct this. I'm a little surprised we don't know anything more about the shooter, to be honest with you, other than he took a train, which I think is very strange. He had a couple of weapons and knives. You were there last night, Christina. We were at the table together.
Yeah.
Somehow he runs in, he gets pretty darn close to the ballroom, and then we heard the gunshots. And so, there were a lot of unanswered questions. I didn't know if it was going to be like in Austin, Texas. We had the property of Allah Islamist terrorist, It doesn't look like that's the case here. And I don't know what motivates somebody to do something like this, and we don't know the answer to that right now.
Very quickly before I let you go, you said you think Congress should look into why all the cabinet officials were there, the last survivor issue. But I'm wondering if you think there should be a congressional investigation into what we've been talking about, how we got that far, the perimeter and the security precautions around the president.
Oh, yeah, 100%. And we will. And I think the Homeland Security Committee will be charged with that responsibility. But I do, let's not lose fact that the Secret Service immediately popped up in the room, went into action, and the Capitol Police. So I'm very proud of what they did.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us, Congressman Mike McCaul. Nice to see you again.
Up next, we're going to speak with Democratic lawmaker Don Beyer of Virginia. That is straight ahead on Bloomberg this weekend, right here on Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, and at Bloomberg.com.
Thank you for joining us on Bloomberg this weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. The armed suspect who tried to enter a Washington ballroom where President Donald Trump was speaking was likely targeting administration officials. Now, that's according to Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche on an interview with Meet the Press. Blanche said 31-year-old Cole Thomas Allen is believed to have acted alone after traveling by train from California. He had been staying at the Washington Hilton, which was hosting the annual White House Correspondents' Dinner. Jeffrey Carroll, he's Metropolitan Police Department interim chief. He described the scene outside of the ballroom.
We know the individual charged the checkpoint with a firearm in his hand. We know he was running in the direction of the ballroom that the president was in, as well as other cabinet members. So what his specific motivation was, we can't say at this point.
President Trump said he would like the event to be rescheduled in the next 30 days. Now, in other news, a planned trip to Pakistan by President Trump's top envoys has been canceled. The president on Saturday, he told his son-in-law Jared Kushner and special envoy Steve Witkoff to skip the trip, adding in a social media post that there has been too much time wasted on traveling. Now, meanwhile, Iran's top diplomat left Islamabad ahead of the planned arrival of U.S. envoys. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, he met mediators in Pakistan, calling his visit, quote, very fruitful, but said Iran has yet to see if the U.S. is truly serious about diplomacy. Christina and David, over to you.
Lisa, thanks very much. And going into the show yesterday, we thought that'd be the focus of our conversations this morning, that back and forth, the talks about the talks, as our Washington Bureau Chief Peggy Collins put it yesterday, which have been playing out over the course of this week. Would they continue or not? Seems like they are off. The Iranian foreign minister having moved on and this other trip not taking place. Still very much an open question, the background to what we're talking about mostly this morning.
That's exactly right. And before we move to the news of day, one of the things that really told you that those talks were no longer happening is I saw reporters who've been there on the ground saying that they were taking down those security barricades and all the things that they had set up to make those talk safe and secure and facilitate that operations. Sometimes logistics guys know before the policy guys.
Yes, I don't want to call it security theater, but all of the apparatus, the security apparatus that was there, taken down.
Exactly right. Okay, we want to turn now to Democratic Congressman Don Beyer of Virginia. He serves on the Ways and Means and Joint Economic Committees. Congressman, thank you for coming down. I know, it's been a long day. I know you weren't at the dinner last night, but I also know you know what's going on and you watched it. I just want to get your reactions to what happened and where you think we go from here and what, if anything, Congress should be investigating.
My youth was dominated by the assassination of President Kennedy, Dr. King, Bobby Kennedy. And we had this long, other than the tragic shots at the same hotel with Ronald Reagan, a long period of time with peacefulness. This has really been upsetting. And you find that on Capitol Hill, there's a lot more security all around, metal detectors everywhere, a lot more Capitol Police. They actually put a lot of money in the budget for personal security for members. And now when we do town hall meetings, we're always talking to the local police, making sure there's 2 or 3 of them there. Just in case.
And that's because the rhetoric has gotten so heated.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a terrible thing. I don't support much of what President Trump has done, but the last thing I want is for him to be shot.
Let me give you a variation on the question I asked the Chairman Emeritus of the Foreign Affairs Committee. That is, has it affected the way that you go about your job, your awareness of that rhetoric, a sense that something terrible could happen at a town hall or a public event? Or is it something you worry about or think about?
I don't worry about it. I think my wife worries about it more than I do. Also, I don't feel like I'm a particularly high profile in terms of going viral. If I were AOC or Marjorie Taylor Greene, somebody like that, I'd be much more worried about it. So.
We have Attorney General Todd Blanche was on CNN moments ago. We want to play you what he just said. We've got some sound.
From our preliminary investigation, it does appear the suspect was targeting members of the administration. I don't want to go beyond that because we don't have specifics yet about particular members of the administration, except that we do understand that that was his goal and his target.
He, of course, is the acting AG. I want to correct myself there. But what is your take on the fact that he was there to possibly harm not just the president, but members of the administration and the cabinet and people who may not be as high profile, maybe not safe in this climate either?
Yeah, although, if you look through different administrations, a lot of Trump's folks, think Pete Hegseth or Kash Patel, they're much higher profile than Pam Bondi, than they have been in the past. I'm trying to think. Sometimes you reach back and say, who was that person for Barack Obama or Joe Biden?
We want to talk about what's happened in Virginia politics over the last few weeks. But let me get one more question to you about this, and that is, how would you like to see Congress's role going forward in all of this? So it's early hours yet, not even early days yet in this investigation. The suspect likely to be charged on Monday, as we understand it. What's Congress's role here in the wake of what happened yesterday?
The very first thing, David, I'd say is that we continue to try to improve our rhetoric. That we're the country, one of the things that most upsets me is that we're more divided than we've ever been. Maybe back to the Civil War. We seem to have different understandings of who we are and our factories, our understanding of our history. So the notion of treating each other with respect, even though we could have very different policy approaches, seems to still be essential to that.
Should Congress be investigating either why so many members within the line of succession were in the same room or the security apparatus and how this all happened?
I was really concerned when I saw it was Marco Rubio and the vice president and the president. That was really concerning. I know it shouldn't just be one person that could take over.
Should you be investigating that? Should Congress investigate that?
Well, that would be a good oversight thing for sure. On Ways and Means, I tend not to thinking more about the tariffs and the taxes.
Fair enough, and plenty to think about there. We can talk about that in a minute as well. But let's talk about redistricting and what's happening in Virginia, indeed what's stalled for the moment in Virginia. I was saying during the break, I was on vacation traveling through Virginia, and the signs were everywhere. Vote yes, vote no.
Oh, really?
Yes, on this referendum. Just a few days. It's still up. See if they get taken down. It did pass what your governor had pushed for here, this redistricting that was advantageous for Democrats. Now it's a standstill as Republicans have filed a lawsuit against it. Where does it stand? How do you see all of this playing out? And I don't need to point out we're getting closer and closer here to the midterm elections.
Well, I was glad that it passed with some reluctance. We passed a constitutional amendment 4 or 5 years ago getting rid of gerrymandering. So we have the least gerrymandered districts in the country before this. But after Donald Trump said he was entitled to 5 seats in Texas, they took 3 in North Carolina, 2 in Ohio, 1 coming up in Missouri. Florida's about to meet, I think, to do the same thing. We felt we had to push back. And we got 3 million people showed up. It was gubernatorial-style turnout for an election in April. And it didn't pass by a lot, 3%. That's 90,000 votes. And now, in a perfect Democratic world, it's 10 Democrats and 1 Republican. But that's not a given. We still have to go win those seats. And we'll be running, in many cases, against Republican incumbents who've been there many years and have deep relationships in the community.
But I do want to ask you, as we talk about turning down the political rhetoric, it is very hard to get elected as a moderate in Congress right now, partly because of the way these districts are drawn and the way voters are mobilized, that they tend to vote for the extremes of the party, which is why initially Democrats were the, when they go low, we go high party. Could there be a potential backlash to changing tactics here, and that the things you say that we should have in Congress might be harder to get?
There could be a backlash, but Christine, you go to something that's been really important to me in my 11 years in Congress, which is the notion that you have so many safe seats that Democrats have to run to the left in their primary, Republicans run to the right. We typically worry about who's going to take us out in the primary, not in the general election. Right. And that then means when you come to Congress, there's no overlap. When I was a kid, there were lots of very conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. You don't have many of them anymore. not to get nerdy on you, but there's the
We love nerdy. This is Bloomberg. Bring it on.
Okay, the Fair Representation Act, which I've been pushing for 11 years, takes us back to multi-member districts, which we had for the first 60 years in America, and ranked choice voting. And that then makes you, Northern Virginia that I represent would have 3 districts, and you'd be fighting for the middle rather than the extreme. It would hopefully bring, also you end up, not that you don't want to have the extremes, the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the like, but it should get cut off those ends and bring people back together.
You mentioned your own Ways and Means. You're also the senior Democrat on the Joint Economic Committee. We just got news that Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina is prepared to go ahead with voting for Kevin Warsh because of what's happened with the investigation into Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve. Your reaction to that, I wonder if you are a supporter of Kevin Warsh's candidacy for that position, and also just your reaction to the way that all of this has unfolded, both the investigation on the Justice Department side and now it being punted over to the IG at the Federal Reserve.
Well, I'm thrilled that they've withdrawn the case against Jay Powell. It was silly to begin with. If you look at cost overruns, there are so many in the federal government for many, many different reasons. And the thought that blaming him for it was pretty ridiculous. I'm so glad that Senator Tillis had stood up for that. And for Kevin Warsh, it's interesting. You look at his history, he was largely a deficit hawk and somebody that believed in managing higher interest rates. So, and I was very pleased with his testimony, saying that he wasn't going to be a sock puppet for Donald Trump.
But do you think this is enough for Powell to step away? Because as we've been talking about here, there's no guarantee that they can't restart this investigation. He could do what the president wants him to do and then still end up facing these charges.
Yeah, but as we've seen with so many of these investigations, once you get to a grand jury, they throw it out right away. You know, there's a lot of this is showmanship. And it costs the poor person that's being persecuted, dollars
time
for lawyers,
and money,
time and money, and anxiety. And,
of course.
So it's unfair. And the going after political enemies, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, is a bad thing.
You, again, Joint Economic Committee, have a great vantage on this U.S. economy, its place in the global economy. This war is continuing, lasting longer than the president said it would, and we've heard so many warning signs from our guests, policymakers, and experts about what the fallout has been so far and what it's likely to be as we see in Asia, parts of the world, real difficulty in getting oil, getting refined fuel products and
fertilizer,
all that's going to have. Your sense of what this means for the economy, how worried you are about the prospects of a war that lasts longer and longer?
Well, I think one of the main reasons Donald Trump got elected was because of all the inflation during COVID, which is during Biden. And his tariffs have moved us in the wrong direction. And then the war is having a huge impact on both grocery prices and fuel. I'm paying, in Northern Virginia, it's only $4.99 to fill my car.
Only.
And it could get worse. However, big picture, I still very much believe in the American economy. We have an awful lot of interesting things going on, including, and I know Mike and I, your previous guest, co-chair of the AI caucus, there's so much good coming out of AI, including 5% productivity growth in the last quarter, and so much danger because of the real plausibility of huge job displacement.
You were studying it, weren't you? I remember that. You were like studying AI.
I'm still
getting a master's or something like that.
Yeah, I still get 9 courses to go out at George Mason, but I'm working on it. So.
We only have a tiny bit of time, but when it comes to AI, spiking energy prices, this is all coming into focus with what's going on in Iran, and there's a crunch on supply and demand and everything else. As you look towards the midterms, as you look towards November, you talk about those kitchen table issues and how they got President Trump into office. Will Democrats take advantage of that, and will this help you going into the fall?
Oh, I think so. You know, things look very good right now, but it's April, and a week's a long time in politics. But we have many seats we think we can take, relatively few that we need to defend. And with the president's disapproval rating at 58%, this is potentially a wave election. Although you look back to Charlie Cook, he said wave elections tend to follow wave elections one way or the other, so there aren't that. We have to temper our expectations. And we really only need 3 or 4 seats.
The gentleman from the 8th Congressional District of Virginia, Don Beyer, thank you very much for joining us here.
Thank you,
Great to talk about the Commonwealth of Virginia and the news of the day as well. We're going to have much more on the breaking news I mentioned just a moment ago on the shooting at the White House Correspondents Association dinner. After this, also talk more about those comments from Senator Tom Tillis on Meet the Press about Kevin Warsh and Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. You're watching Bloomberg This Weekend on Bloomberg TV, Bloomberg Radio, and Bloomberg.com.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. We're learning more about the man accused of storming the White House Correspondents' dinner. According to a law enforcement intelligence profile reviewed by Bloomberg, Cole Thomas Allen, he spent years quietly acquiring his arsenal, purchasing a shotgun from a Torrance, California firearms dealer 8 months before the attack, and a semi-automatic pistol 2 years earlier. Now he's expected to be arraigned on Monday. President Trump said no country is immune from political violence.
I was talking to somebody from another country today, and they have numerous assassinations of political figures all over the world. You look at South America, it's like some of the numbers are just horrific. It's dangerous stuff, whether it's here or someplace else. No country is immune.
The president added that he wants the event rescheduled within 30 days. Now, in other news, a ceasefire in jeopardy after President Trump canceled a planned trip to Pakistan by his top envoys for negotiations over the Iran conflict. And Iran's top diplomat met mediators in Pakistan and left Islamabad well ahead of the planned arrival of U.S. envoys. Now, despite Iran tensions and also developments in Washington, D.C., King Charles III and Queen Camilla, they are still expected to begin their 4-day trip tomorrow to the U.S. The formal arrival ceremony that will take place on Tuesday. And Republican Senator Tom Tillis says he's prepared to move ahead with a confirmation of Federal Reserve Chair nominee Kevin Warsh. Now, he made those comments during an NBC interview this morning. It comes after the Justice Department ended a criminal probe targeting Fed Chair Jay Powell. Christina and David, we'll send it over to you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Earlier, and just a little while ago, we spoke with Virginia Democrat Don Beyer and Texas Congressman Michael McCaul about toning down the political rhetoric in the wake of that shooting at the White House Correspondents' Dinner.
Here to discuss more is Rising Communications founder and former Republican congressional advisor Leslie Shedd and former senior advisor for political engagement during the Biden administration, John McCarthy. Great to have both of you with us. We saw you at the dinner last night. And John, let me start with you. I'm kind of piecing together each of our own experience of what unfolded there. And I'm curious sort of where you were in the room and the degree to which in the moment you had an understanding of what was happening, what unfolded after that.
Well, I don't think that anybody in the moment had any, clear picture of what was going on. Obviously, it being a room full of journalists, people kind of then, once the activities stopped, went around the room and kind of started comparing notes. And I think I heard about 6 different retellings of what had actually transpired. I was sitting at the back of the room, kind of by the door where a lot of the main central activity occurred. And my face was to the door. And at the time, you saw agents kind of come out of that door. You'd hear gunshots. And at that point, people dropped to the table pretty quickly. It's obviously a very crowded ballroom, and people watching don't always know, but you don't actually know a lot of the people you're sitting around necessarily. So about half your table is kind of under the tablecloths. Other people have their heads down. That transpires for a couple of minutes probably, and then folks kind of started to put their heads up. And then there ended up being a lot more kind of noise coming from the center of the room, which in retrospect was probably the detailees being kind of removed from the room.
The cabinet members.
Exactly. And then the thing that really amazed me is kind of once that seemed to clear, I mean, there was no kind of announcement that everything had cleared.
None.
But the thing that kind of amazed me is once you're looking up for a second, you look around the room, and I mean, I spent 4 years in the last administration, and I have always been so amazed by the Secret Service. I mean, without missing a beat, I mean, they stood up and physically stood in front of the president, which I am always amazed by them. And then I was really amazed by the journalists in the room. The fact that they were able to kind of stand up and just start muscle memory, kicking in, start doing their job again, I thought was pretty remarkable. And, people sometimes give this dinner and this weekend a little flack, but, as you looked around the room and saw those people kind of stepping in and doing what they're supposed to do in that moment, it kind of reminded you that what they're doing is very important and that a lot of the people who do it are very good at it.
And you also said we've been talking about the other folks who helped make that dinner happen, including a lot of the back of house staff. And you said at some point you saw them with their hands up, or
yeah, in the kind of rooms that kind of open up off the ballroom, a couple of the doors flung open, and it looked at some point that they were kind of being held in kind of a security-like posture. And that was pretty alarming, too, because at this point, you didn't know what was happening at all. You didn't know if someone was still in the room. You didn't know how many. And again, no one sits and says, OK, now you're clear. Feel free to move about. So it was kind of a jarring posture. And, a lot of the people in that room are probably used to being around, protected individuals, situations like this. Obviously, a lot of the journalists were there for the incident in Pennsylvania with President Trump.
And January 6th.
But for these people who, are there just to kind of support this function, I've been going to the dinner for years, and I've actually really enjoyed talking to a lot of the wait staff there because they actually take such a point of pride in working there. I actually remember a couple of years ago, there was this one man who was a waiter there, and I was asking him how many of these he'd worked at. And he actually went back in and pulled out a bunch of the old programs that he kept there with him because he always took it as such a point of pride that he gets to kind of work at this historic event. And it really, when you step back for a second, it is exactly what Washington is supposed to be, in the sense of it should be about mutual respect. It should be about lowering the temperature and finding kind of comedy in difficult times. So, I mean, again, every kind of player in it, from the waitstaff to the journalists in the room, kind of all ended up doing what they were supposed to do. And it does kind of give you some hope and humanity in pretty difficult times.
Leslie, I want to ask you about rhetoric. So there have been these calls to tone down the rhetoric. I mean, I think the conversation about rhetoric began before the event itself. There were a lot of people wondering what tack the president would take, giving this speech to the White House Correspondents Association and its guests, given he hadn't gone to the dinner before, given what he said to the press before. There was a marked change in his tone last night. When he did speak to the press in the briefing room, he was very gracious to the president of the association, and also somewhat jokingly said he couldn't give the speech that he intended to give after what had happened. It's maybe folly to kind of look at a moment like this and predict whether it's going to change things, but does it feel like this is a moment when there's the prospect of change in the way that people of differing views get along with
Yes, I mean, I would love to see that, right? Civility in our conversation, it seems to be gone, and it's really frustrating and scary when you work in politics to think, I can't go to a party with my friends without having to walk through magnometers and have Secret Service and police and roads closed off everywhere just so that we can get together and celebrate the First Amendment. I mean, it's just it's a scary time. I will say one of the things that stood out to me last night with the president's remarks was when he said, you know, it wasn't a Trump event. There were Republicans there, there were Democrats there, conservatives, liberals, members of the media. We were all gathered there together to celebrate the First Amendment, and this horrible thing happened. And it's scary to me more than anything.
But, you know, Mike McCaul, your former boss, who you worked with a long time, we just swapped you out of these seats. He was saying that this is not something you can legislate. And there is a point to that. So what do? You're a realist. You've been in this town a long time, but you guys are on opposite ends and are very close friends.
Yeah.
What do you do? Does it have to come from the top down, or could Republicans in Congress take the lead on this, and will they?
I don't want to not place blame on different politicians and people in D.C. For sure, there are definitely some politicians that have not great rhetoric on both sides of the aisle. But, you know, you just said that. John and I are friends. I have a lot of friends that are Democrats. Republicans and Democrats get along here. This is our city. We all work together. We all live together. I do think that there's a lot of camaraderie between Republicans, Democrats, journalists, you know, people that work here. And that what you see online often are people that don't know anything about D.C. They've never been here before. They see something online and they want to be a part of a conversation, or they have a specific, you know, idea about something, and they go off the rails. This guy came from California. So, you know, I think that the congressman's right. They're trying to legislate the way that somebody thinks, and especially in a country that prioritizes free speech, it's going to be hard. I do think that, you know, we want to see more leaders out there trying to lower the tone of the rhetoric. And, you know, Congressman McCaul is a perfect example of that. I think he mentioned this. He was just at a big event like last week, I think, in Texas with Henry Cuellar, talking about the importance of bipartisanship and civility.
Yeah, and I mean, I hope that that's true. I think there's kind of two issues at hand here. The first of which is there's not really a political reward for being a centrist and being kind of a, you know, not that flashy, not that exciting elected official.
That's true, and that's not what, and we're partly to blame for this as well, because that's not what we pick up. We don't.
That was the second point. Yeah, exactly. I was going to say.
I beat you to it.
I was going to say that's part of the problem, whether it's the media or the algorithms. It doesn't reward someone who wants to sit and say, have you read my substantive white paper on this issue? Instead, it's the kind of snappy soundbite that gets the political reward in the end. So, you know, I think that these elected officials need to step up and remember that they are really elected to be, in many ways, chief citizens, but simultaneously both the media and, of course, the tech platforms, et cetera, need to also recognize that they play an important moderating force in all of this, too.
John, I will read your snappy white paper on whatever issue you've got.
David Gura reads all of the snappy white papers. John McCarthy, Leslie said, hang on, we're going to keep you here. Actually, we got to go to break, but we want to keep talking to you more about all of this because a lot to break down. And we do want to talk, we don't want you to fight, but we want to talk a little bit about some of the contentious issues going on the Hill. We are still in a partial government shutdown. We've got a Fed chair. We've got a whole bunch of other stuff. And the king is going to visit. So we want to discuss all of this. So stay in your seats. And you at home, please stay in your seats. Bloomberg This Weekend will be right back on all the platforms. Stick with us this morning.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. David Gura with Christina Ruffini. We have John McCarthy and Leslie Shedd with us again as well. John, let me start with you on what's just transpired over the last hour. That is Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina has dropped his opposition to the nomination of Kevin Warsh. He had blocked it in protest because of what had been happening with the Department of Justice and Jerome Powell. He writes in a statement that he's posted on X, with the assurances that he's gotten, I look forward to supporting Kevin Warsh's confirmation. He is an outstanding nominee, and it's time for the Federal Reserve to move beyond this distraction and return its full attention to its mission. Curious for your reaction broadly, but more specifically, your reaction to this emboldened Thom Tillis, who, yes, is outgoing. His days are numbered as senator from North Carolina. But what is his attitude toward this, the way that he's approached this, say to you about the way that lawmakers, perhaps more broadly, could take a stand in a way that they haven't in recent months and years?
Yeah, I mean, outgoing lawmakers tend to be some of the emboldened, yes, but they also, are the most ones open to deal making. When I was back in the Biden administration, when we were looking towards the bipartisan infrastructure law, the senators who are really available to us are no longer serving, by and large. They're the ones who are willing to kind of cross the aisle, get a couple things done, and they're thinking about their legacy. The only thing I would caution here is that assurances tend to not last very long inside of the Trump administration. I think we saw a lot of assurances given around the nomination of Secretary Kennedy. We've heard people kind of speak out since, saying that they were a little concerned about some of his actions since. So I don't know, what these assurances were, but I don't know that I would, take them to the bank if I were the senator.
Leslie, I want to get your take on why this happened, why the DOJ backed off this investigation, because the president had gone really hard on this despite members of his own party saying you are, as my mother would say, cutting off your nose despite your face. You have a long-term goal. This is going to complicate it. Why was he so set on this in the first place, and what do you think ultimately changed his mind?
Well, I want to start by saying I am here for Thom Tillis's YOLO-like moment right now. I honestly just can't wait to see what happens next on this one because, he's funny and he cares about stuff and he's not afraid to hold people's feet to the fire. I'm a lawyer, too. I like to say I play a lawyer on TV. But I think if you go through and look at the case, it just wasn't a strong case. And attorneys can actually get in trouble if they are pursuing cases like aggressively over time where they just don't have the evidence to back that up. So I would be willing to bet it's probably a little bit to do with that, probably definitely to do with the Kevin Warsh nomination. I personally thought always that this was a bit of a distraction. We've got a really big election coming up in November.
A little bit.
And I'd really like to see, the president and the administration be 100% focused on that right now.
We were talking about gerrymandering and what happened in Virginia a couple of weeks back, and I'm curious how you see the evolution of this story. So Florida is poised perhaps to do some of this itself, but I think a warning that we got early on was if Republicans initially were to start doing this, it would be this kind of tit-for-tat thing, and lo, it seems to have been that. Where do you see all of this leading, this conversation about the way that states decide?
Yeah, so I think,
boundaries?
No offense to John, but I think that there was kind of a belief among Republicans that Democrats would roll over because they had been for quite, several months at the beginning of the administration.
Several years, perhaps. It's the story of the Democratic Party right there.
Look at this agreement. Okay, anyway.
So, I think we're at a wash kind of right now, right? Like 10 seats for Democrats, 9 seats for Republicans. I go back again to, I just feel like this is a bit of a distraction. It's taking time away from people. It's taking money away. It's taking political capital away that I would rather be seen invested in races that we need to try to protect, members that we already have, as well as really great candidates that we've got coming up. And, I know there's a lot of attention paid to these federal races, but we've got a lot of really great governors candidates, attorneys general candidates. There's going to be a lot of interesting races this November. So,
all right, we've got about 2 minutes left.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
Go ahead. I would just say it actually exemplifies the tension that's in the Democratic Party right now, because this is something that Democrats would largely not be for, right? Democrats have overwhelmingly, each Congress, introduced a lot of good government bills, from money out of politics to independent redistricting. But there's also this new lane of the party that's telling them that they want their nominee to fight more. So I think that this is playing out in a really weird way, where Democrats are trying to find their new footing in this new generation. And I think that's why you're seeing some of the kind of, outside groups come in and support with such vigor some of these independent redistricting efforts, reforms, but, these kind of more partisan efforts in practice.
Trying to correct the overcorrection, right?
Yes.
With Joe Biden, that was this overcorrection, I think, to President Trump, and trying to figure out this new happy medium. How can they be, against the way that they don't like the way the president speaks or his policies, but still be interesting and, get attention?
Exactly.
We've got a very short jump ball here. when it comes to kitchen table issues and the midterms and November, which party is going to do it better?
Easily Democrats. I mean, the Republican Party, the Republican Party's not been able to focus on this since they got here. I mean, the president had a mandate to lower costs, and I mean, take your pick: Ballroom, wars, foreign invasions. None of that is bringing down costs.
I don't need Oz the mentalist here to
Leslie?
figure this one out, but
No,
Leslie, what?
It's definitely Republicans. And I know everybody's surprised, right? But I think too the biggest reason is that Republicans have a record to run on. Right now, I just see a lot of anti-Trump stuff for Democrats, and not a lot of ideas.
Leslie Shedd, John McCarthy, thanks to both of you for joining us here on this Sunday after what was an eventful and difficult weekend for a lot of folks. But appreciate your perspective here on this Sunday morning.
Thank you both so much. If Washington worked like you two, I think we'd all be in a better state. So we appreciate you. And we appreciate all our viewers and listeners and streamers today. We had a lot of news. Lisa Mateo, of course, is with us. And we want to thank Lisa.
It's been a pleasure. You guys have been rocking since we started this show, and you have been keeping holding down the fort. It's even hard to think at this point.
And great thanks to you for getting us all of the up-to-date news about the suspect in this investigation and what's unfolding over the course of this morning. Again, we've learned more about that suspect from California, traveled to D.C. By train, expected to be charged here in Washington, D.C. On Monday, and we'll see what happens with further charges on Monday as well. Thank you all for joining us here on Bloomberg This Weekend, live from Washington, D.C. You can join our colleagues in Asia this evening when global markets kick off trading at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini, and of course, we are here with Lisa Mateo. We'll be back with you Saturday from New York at 7 a.m. Please come back with us. We'll see you then. For our audience on Bloomberg TV, Michelle Hussein starts right now.